They say power reveals character, but sometimes it reveals secrets that were never meant to see daylight. Secrets buried beneath layers of deception, waiting for the right moment to emerge and change everything. Snow fell gently across the northern territories of Ironwood as Thong Soi Magnus Blackthorn completed his inspection of the eastern perimeter. The cold never bothered him. 20 years of military service had hardened both his body and his spirit against such trivial discomforts. At 38, his imposing frame carried the evidence of countless battles. A jagged scar across his left cheek from the Battle of Shadow Valley, 3 parallel claw marks extending from his right shoulder down to his elbow from an ambush during the Highland Rebellion, and dozens of smaller marks scattered across his torso, each with its own story of survival. The Border Patrol snapped to attention as Magnus approached. 6 wolves, each chosen for their combat prowess and unquestioning loyalty. Magnus had personally trained every warrior under his command, instilling in them the same iron discipline that had kept him alive through the territory wars a decade ago. "Report," Magnus commanded, his deep voice cutting through the evening air like a blade. Lieutenant Remus stepped forward, fist pressed against his chest in salute. "All clear along the eastern ridge, Thong Soi." The scent markers were refreshed at dawn as ordered. No sign of rogue packs or hunters. Magnus nodded, his dark eyes scanning the tree line beyond the patrol route. Something felt wrong tonight. A tension in the air, a whisper of change carried on the winter wind. His wolf sensed it too, pacing restlessly beneath his skin, hackles raised in warning. "Double the night patrol. I want 3 scouts positioned along Raven's Peak before midnight." Confusion flashed across Remus's face. "Sir, we haven't had security concerns in this region for almost—" "That wasn't a suggestion, Lieutenant." The words carried the unmistakable weight of Alpha Command, causing several of the younger soldiers to lower their eyes instinctively. Magnus didn't abuse his power, but neither did he tolerate questioning when his instincts were screaming danger. Remus saluted again and began issuing orders to his unit. Magnus turned away, facing the darkening forest. The last light of day bled from the sky, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of crimson and gold. Beautiful but ominous, the color of spilled blood. The last time he'd seen a sunset this red was the night before the massacre at Frost River. His calm stone vibrated against his chest. The enchanted obsidian was warm to the touch as he withdrew it from beneath his armor. Only 3 people had stones attuned to his second-in-command, the council elder, and Sulauthon Garrick. This call originated from the military headquarters. "Blackthorn," he answered. Captain Wolf's voice emerged from the stone, tense and urgent. "Sir, you're needed at headquarters immediately. Border Patrol found something? Someone. You need to see this personally." Magnus closed his hand around the stone, terminating the connection. He turned to Remus, who was already waiting for further orders. "I'm returning to headquarters. Maintain the perimeter. If anything unusual occurs, anything at all, I want to know immediately." The journey back to Ironwood's military command center took Magnus less than 20 minutes at a full run. The guards at the main gate saluted sharply as he passed, his expression warning against unnecessary conversation. His boots echoed against stone floors as he strode through the ancient fortress that had served as military headquarters for over 4 centuries. The command center was a flurry of unusual activity. Magnus spotted Captain Wolf immediately, a young but promising officer who had earned his position through exceptional tactical insight rather than bloodline or connections. At 32, Wolf was one of the few officers Magnus trusted implicitly. "Report," Magnus demanded, foregoing any greeting. Wolf gestured toward the secure holding area. "Patrol found her collapsed near the northern border, sir. Omega female, mid-20s, no pack scent. Claims she escaped from a rogue pack that was decimated in the Southern Territories." Magnus narrowed his eyes. "An Omega? Alone? That's practically unheard of." "Yes, sir. First one I've seen in my lifetime." Omegas were the rarest designation in werewolf society, making up less than 5% of their population. Most were protected fiercely by their packs, valued for their healing abilities and the emotional stability they provided to the more volatile alphas and betas. An unaccompanied Omega was as unusual as finding a diamond in a coal mine, and potentially just as valuable. "Has she been processed?" Magnus asked. "Medical evaluation is complete. No serious injuries, just exhaustion and mild exposure. Eleanor is with her now." That was something, at least. Eleanor Frost was the pack's head healer, a stern but fair woman who had served alongside Magnus during the territory wars. She'd patched the Omega up while ensuring she wasn't a threat. Name? Calls herself Celine, no surname given. Magnus nodded. I want to interrogate her myself. Wolf hesitated. Sir, with respect, she's quite weak. Eleanor suggested. I didn't ask for Eleanor's medical opinion, Captain. I need to assess whether this Omega poses a security threat to our territory. Wolf knew better than to argue further. He led Magnus through the secure corridor to the medical wing. The isolation room was small but well appointed. A bed, a small table, a chair, and basic amenities. It was designed for medical quarantine, not imprisonment, but the reinforced door and observation window served dual purposes. Through the glass, Magnus observed the Omega. She sat perched on the edge of the bed, back straight despite her apparent exhaustion. Her dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, framing a face that showed signs of recent hardship, but retained an undeniable elegance. Even from here, he could see her eyes, an unusual silver that seemed to catch and reflect the light. Eleanor stood nearby, recording notes on a medical tablet. The older woman looked up as Magnus and Wolf approached, her expression hardening slightly. She excused herself from the Omega and stepped into the hallway. Magnus, she greeted, deliberately omitting his title, a privilege earned through decades of friendship. I was about to send for you. How is our guest? Magnus asked, his eyes still fixed on the Omega through the window. Eleanor folded her arms. Physically, she'll recover quickly. Good constitution, despite being underweight and dehydrated. Mentally, she paused. She's remarkably composed for someone who claims to have witnessed her entire pack being slaughtered. That caught Magnus's attention. Too composed? I've treated enough trauma victims to know that everyone processes differently. But yes, there's something unusual about her reactions. She describes horrific events with clinical detachment. Either she's in deep shock or she's lying, Magnus finished. I need to speak with her. Eleanor sighed. Fine, but remember she's still recovering. And Magnus? She placed a hand on his arm, forcing him to look at her. She's an Omega. They respond better to gentleness than intimidation. Magnus grunted noncommittally. In his experience, designation meant little when it came to deception. He'd been betrayed by an Omega once before, during the territory wars, a mistake that cost 16 of his men their lives. He wouldn't make the same error again. He entered the room alone, closing the door firmly behind him. The Omega, Celine, watched him with those strange silver eyes, her expression revealing nothing as she assessed him in return. Up close, Magnus could see she was smaller than she'd appeared through the window, perhaps 5'6", with the delicate build typical of Omegas. Yet something about her bearing seemed incongruous with her designation. There was a stillness to her, a watchfulness that reminded him more of a seasoned scout than a traumatized refugee. I am Thong Soi Magnus Blackthorn, commander of Ironwood's military forces and head of security for the Northern Territories, he stated, remaining standing to maintain the height advantage. You're in a secure facility within Ironwood territory. I have questions that require honest answers. Celine inclined her head slightly, an acknowledgement, not submission. I understand, Commander. I'll answer what I can. Her voice surprised him, clear and composed, with an accent he couldn't quite place. Not Southern, despite her claimed origins. It carried notes of a more refined upbringing than she was admitting to. Let's start with who you really are, Magnus said, crossing his arms over his broad chest. Your full name and your pack of origin. As I told your healer, my name is Celine. I have no surname now. I was born to the Moonshade pack in the Southern Territories, but they no longer exist. Moonshade, Magnus repeated, his tone skeptical. Interesting. That pack was reportedly destroyed over 14 years ago during the territory wars. You would have been a child. A flicker of something, surprise, concern, crossed Celine's face before her expression smoothed again. You're well informed, Commander. Yes, the main branch was decimated during the wars. A small fragment survived, led by Beta Corvus. We rebuilt in secret until 3 weeks ago, when we were discovered and executed by Crimson Eclipse forces. Magnus circled slowly around her, noting how she turned slightly to keep him in view, another behavior atypical for Omegas, who rarely perceive physical threat from potential pack members. Crimson Eclipse operates primarily in the Western Territories. They haven't been seen this far north in years. He stopped directly in front of her. You've traveled an impressive distance for someone with no serious injuries. Necessity is a powerful motivator, Commander. Indeed. Magnus leaned forward slightly, intentionally crowding her space. Most Omegas would shrink back, instinctively seeking to appease an imposing alpha. Celine didn't move an inch. What brought you specifically to Ironwood territory? There are at least 3 other pack territories you would have crossed to reach us. Your reputation, she answered simply. Ironwood is known to be fair, even to outsiders. The other territories have different priorities. It was a diplomatic answer, but not necessarily wrong. The bordering territories were known for their isolationist policies and hostility to refugees. Still, something about this Omega story wasn't adding up. Show me your hands, Magnus demanded suddenly. Celine hesitated only briefly before extending both hands, palms up. Magnus took them in his larger ones, turning them over to examine her fingers and palms. Her hands were too soft for someone who'd been surviving in the wilderness for weeks. There were calluses, yes, but not in the patterns typical of outdoor survival. These were more consistent with weapons training, similar to the markings on his own hands from years wielding various blades. He released her hands and stepped back. You're not telling me everything, Celine of no surname. Your hands tell a different story than your mouth. She withdrew her hands to her lap. We all have secrets, Commander. Not all are relevant to your security concerns. I'll be the judge of what's relevant. Magnus moved to the door. You'll remain here under observation. Food and clean clothing will be provided. Tomorrow, once you've rested, we'll continue this discussion. I suggest you consider being more forthcoming. As he turned to leave, Celine spoke again. Commander Blackthorne. Something in her tone made him pause. The threat I fled is real, whether you believe my story or not. Crimson Eclipse is moving again, and their reach extends further than you realize. Magnus looked back at her, studying her face for signs of manipulation or deception. Finding none, he nodded curtly. We'll talk tomorrow. Outside the room, he found Eleanor waiting, arms crossed, and expression skeptical. Well, is she a traumatized refugee or a danger to us all? Neither. Or both. Magnus ran a hand through his dark hair, streaked with premature silver at the temples. She's hiding something significant. Have her closely monitored. No contact with anyone except you and the guards I'll assign personally. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. You think an exhausted Omega is a security threat? I think appearances can be deceiving, old friend. Something about her doesn't add up. The way she holds herself, the calluses on her hands, her lack of submissive behavior toward an alpha. He shook his head. Keep her comfortable, but contained until I return. Magnus left the medical wing and headed directly to the fortress archives. If this Celine was lying about her identity or origins, he needed to know why. His responsibilities as Thong Soi didn't allow for giving anyone the benefit of the doubt, not with the safety of thousands under his protection. The archives were housed in the oldest section of the fortress, 3 levels below ground. The massive iron door was guarded by 2 senior soldiers who saluted as Magnus approached. Beyond the door lay the collective knowledge and history of the Ironwood Pack and, to some extent, the entire Northern Alliance. The archivist, a beta named Morris who had served in this capacity for over 30 years, looked up in surprise as Magnus entered. Few visited the archives at this late hour. Thong Soi, he greeted, rising from his desk. An unexpected honor. How may I assist you? I need information on the Moonshade Pack from the Southern Territories. Specifically their structure before and after the Territory Wars, and any records of survivors. Morris blinked rapidly, his mind visibly sorting through mental catalogs. Moonshade, yes, I believe we have several records. The comprehensive history from before the wars, a casualty list, and I believe a territorial dissolution decree from about 12 years ago. Bring me everything. While Morris gathered the requested materials, Magnus sent a secure message to Siu Lauthan Garrick. If anyone could shed light on inconsistencies in the Omega story, it would be the former Thong Soi who had led Ironwood through the territory wars before passing the mantle to Magnus. At 67, Garrick had officially retired from military service, but his mind remained sharp as a freshly honed blade, and his network of informants extended throughout the known territories. Magnus spent hours reviewing the historical documents. The Moonshade Pack had indeed been a significant power in the Southern Territories before the wars, known for their exceptional night-fighting abilities and unique silver-gray coat coloration. They had been nearly wiped out in a surprise attack 14 years ago, with only a handful of confirmed survivors, most of whom were subsequently documented as deceased in later conflicts. There was a brief mention of a Beta Corvus, who had escaped with a small group, but they had been presumed dead after failing to register with any of the established territories in the post-war census. If Celine's story about being from a remnant group led by Corvus was true, they had managed to remain completely hidden for over a decade, a difficult feat in a world where territory was increasingly scarce and contested. As dawn approached, Magnus received a response from Garrick. Interesting development. Meet me at the old watchtower at midday. Come alone. Information sensitive. Magnus closed the ancient tome he'd been studying and rubbed his tired eyes. He'd operated on less sleep during wartime. A few hours of rest would suffice before meeting Garrick and continuing his investigation of their mysterious Omega visitor. He returned to his quarters within the fortress, a Spartan arrangement that reflected his military mindset. No unnecessary comforts or decorations, just functional furniture and weapons mounted on the walls, each one used in actual combat, not merely for display. The large window overlooking the training grounds was the room's sole indulgence, allowing him to observe his troops even during his limited downtime. Sleep came quickly, but brought with it dreams of silver eyes watching him through darkness, of blood on snow, and of a phoenix rising from flames. He woke shortly before noon, feeling more unsettled than rested. The old watchtower stood on the western edge of Ironwood territory, overlooking a steep ravine that provided natural protection against ground assaults. It had been largely superseded by more modern defensive structures, but Garrick maintained it as a personal retreat and unofficial meeting place for sensitive discussions. Magnus arrived precisely at midday, scaling the ancient stone steps with practiced ease. He found Garrick at the top, gazing out across the snow-covered landscape, his silver hair and beard contrasting sharply with the black leather of his traditional military garb. Despite his age, Garrick maintained the posture and alertness of a warrior, his body hardened by decades of service. Magnus, Garrick turned, offering a wolfish grin that revealed slightly elongated canines, a common trait among older werewolves who'd spent significant time in their wolf forms during their prime. Punctual as always. Siulauthen, Magnus greeted with genuine respect, using the formal title that acknowledged Garrick's status as both elder and former military leader. Your message was intriguing. Garrick gestured to a small table where he had laid out a simple meal of bread, dried meat, and a flask of something that smelled potently alcoholic. Eat first, talk second. You look like you've been up all night. They ate in companionable silence, both men accustomed to military efficiency even in meals. When they finished, Garrick produced an ancient leather case from inside his coat and withdrew a yellowed parchment. Your Omega visitor, he began without preamble. I received a message from an old contact in the Eastern Territories. There have been whispers for months about a female matching her description moving between territories, always staying just long enough to access historical archives or sacred sites before disappearing. Magnus frowned. A spy? Perhaps, or a seeker. Garrick unfolded the parchment, revealing a meticulously drawn map of the known territories with several locations marked in red ink. These are the places where she's been sighted. Notice any pattern? Magnus studied the markings. They formed a rough spiral moving inward from the outer territories toward Ironwood. But more significantly, each location corresponded to ancient royal sites, he murmured, realization dawning. The old capitals, ritual grounds, burial chambers of the royal bloodline. Garrick nodded gravely. Precisely. Your visitor has been systematically visiting every location connected to the Drakefire dynasty, the royal bloodline that ruled all territories before the Great Purge 3 generations ago. The implications were startling. The Drakefire dynasty had been systematically eliminated during the bloody coup known as the Great Purge. Their magic-infused bloodline, once thought to be the divine right of rule, had been branded as corruption and abomination by the revolutionary forces led by the Ravencroft family. History recorded that every member of the royal family had been executed, down to distant cousins and infants, their special abilities condemned as unnatural dominance over other werewolves. You think she's researching the royal bloodline? For what purpose? Garrick's expression darkened. There are only 2 possibilities, both concerning. Either she works for the Ravencrofts, hunting down any whispers of surviving royal blood to eliminate the threat to their power. Or, Magnus prompted when Garrick paused, or she is searching for proof of her own lineage. The older wolf's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. There have always been rumors that one royal child escaped the purge. A princess, smuggled away by loyal guards during the palace massacre. Magnus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. That's impossible. The Ravencrofts were thorough. They hunted down every branch of the family tree. So history tells us. Garrick carefully refolded the map. But history is written by victors, Magnus. I was there during the final days of the purge. I saw things. He shook his head, memories darkening his eyes. Things that never made it into official records. Magnus absorbed this information in silence. If there was even a possibility that their visitor had connections to the former royal family, it represented either an unprecedented threat or an extraordinary opportunity for Ironwood. "What's your advice?" he finally asked. "Watch her closely. Test her. The royal bloodline had certain abilities, talents that couldn't be hidden under pressure." Garrick's lips twisted in a grim smile. "And whatever you do, keep this information between us. If word reaches the Ravencroft territories that Ironwood is harboring someone connected to the royal bloodline, whether as researcher or descendant, it would give them the pretext for aggression they've been seeking." Magnus nodded. The Northern Territories had maintained an uneasy peace with the Ravencroft-controlled regions for years, but tensions had been rising. Territorial disputes, resource competition, and ideological differences created constant friction. One spark could ignite a conflict that would dwarf the territory wars. "I'll get to the bottom of this," Magnus promised. "One way or another." They parted soon after, Garrick returning to his private quarters in the village, while Magnus headed back to the fortress. His mind worked through various approaches to extract the truth from their mysterious visitor. Upon his return, Magnus went directly to the security center to review the overnight surveillance of Celine. The footage showed little of interest. She'd slept for several hours, eaten the provided meal, and spent the remaining time sitting in apparently deep meditation. No attempts to escape, no communication with guards. If anything, her complete calm was itself suspicious for someone in her claimed situation. He was about to leave when a detail caught his attention. During her meditation, she had traced patterns in the air with her fingers, subtle movements that might have appeared random to an untrained eye. But Magnus recognized the gestures from ancient military records, silent communication codes used by royal guards during the dynasty era, now largely forgotten except by historical scholars and special operations units. This Omega was definitely not who she claimed to be. He found Captain Wolf reviewing patrol reports and pulled him aside. "I want our guest moved to interrogation room 3. Full security protocol, but no restraints yet. And find Thonglin Thorn. Tell him I request his presence as witness." Wolf looked surprised. "Thorn, sir, he's not exactly sympathetic to refugees." "That's precisely why I want him there. His presence will add pressure, and I need to see how she performs under stress." The captain nodded, though concern flashed across his features. "Understood, sir. When do you want to proceed?" "1 hour, and Wolf, this stays completely confidential. No records, no reports until I authorize them." Magnus spent the next hour reviewing everything known about royal bloodline abilities from the historical archives. The Drakefire dynasty had possessed several unique talents attributed to their bloodline, most notably pyrokinesis, the ability to control fire, enhanced telepathic connections with pack members, and in rare cases, the power to temporarily suppress another werewolf's shift. These abilities had made them nearly impossible to overthrow for generations, until the Ravencrofts had developed silver-based weapons that could neutralize werewolf magic during the purge. If Celine possessed any of these abilities, she had hidden them well so far. But under the right pressure, Interrogation Room 3 was designed for enhanced questioning of high-value targets. Unlike the medical isolation room, it contained no comforts, just a metal table bolted to the floor, 3 chairs, and walls inscribed with ancient runes that dampened werewolf senses and prevented shifting. The lighting was intentionally harsh, designed to create discomfort and disorientation. Thonglin Thorn was waiting when Magnus arrived. At 42, Thorn was one of the most politically powerful alphas in Ironwood, commanding a significant faction within the Council of Elders. His military rank was largely ceremonial. He'd never served in actual combat, but his family's ancient bloodline and vast wealth guaranteed his influence. He made no secret of his ambition to eventually replace Magnus as head of Ironwood's security forces, nor of his hardline stance against outsiders. "Commander Blackthorn," he greeted with a thin smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. Captain Wolf said this was a matter of some sensitivity. "A potential security threat?" Magnus nodded curtly. "An Omega arrived at our borders yesterday claiming to be a refugee from a decimated southern pack. Her story has inconsistencies I intend to resolve. Thorne's eyebrow arched. An Omega? Since when does a single Omega warrant this level of security concern? Since she demonstrated knowledge and training inconsistent with her claimed background. Before Thorne could question further, the door opened and two guards escorted Celine into the room. She'd been provided with clean clothing, simple gray garments that were the standard issue for visitors to Ironwood. Despite the circumstances, she maintained the same composed demeanor Magnus had noted during their first meeting. Her silver eyes took in the room quickly, lingering briefly on the restraint hooks embedded in the table before meeting Magnus's gaze directly. If the intimidating environment affected her, she didn't show it. "Please sit," Magnus instructed, gesturing to the chair opposite him and Thorne. Celine complied, her movements fluid and controlled. She placed her hands flat on the table, a subtle but noticeable gesture that some might interpret as openness, but that Magnus recognized as a defensive posture taught to elite warriors. Hands visible but positioned for rapid response if threatened. "This is Thonglin Thorne, a senior member of our leadership council," Magnus introduced. "The nature of your arrival and certain discrepancies in your account have raised security concerns that we must address directly." Thorne leaned forward, his assessing gaze moving over Celine with unconcealed suspicion. "Let's dispense with pleasantries. You claim to be from the Moonshade Remnant, yet that pack hasn't been officially documented in over a decade. You've traveled hundreds of miles alone, impossible for most Omegas without protection. And according to preliminary reports, you possess combat training consistent with specialized military units." He turned to Magnus with a cold smile. "Did I miss anything, Commander?" "Her hands show weapon training inconsistent with basic survival needs," Magnus added, keeping his tone neutral. "And her knowledge of our territory's layout suggests prior research." Celine remained silent, her expression unchanged as the accusations mounted. When both men finished, she simply said, "Are those questions or statements, gentlemen?" Thorne's eyes narrowed at her composure. "Your attitude does you no favors, Omega. You are a refugee seeking sanctuary in our territory. Cooperation would be in your best interest." "I've answered all questions truthfully," Celine replied. "If you find my answers insufficient, perhaps you're asking the wrong questions." Magnus observed the exchange with interest. Most wolves would show some sign of stress in this environment, especially when confronted by two powerful alphas. Celine's heart rate had increased slightly, he could hear it, but she showed none of the typical stress markers. No increased respiration, no pupil dilation, no scent of fear. "Very well," Magnus said. "Let me ask a direct question. What is your interest in the ancient royal sites of the Drakefire dynasty?" For the first time, genuine surprise flashed across Celine's face, quickly controlled but unmistakable. Thorne glanced at Magnus with newfound interest, clearly not having been briefed on this aspect of the situation. "I don't understand the question," Celine said carefully. "You've been tracked visiting at least 7 locations connected to the former royal family over the past 6 months," Magnus stated flatly. "The ancestral shrine at Moonpeak, the royal archives in Silvercrest, the Drakefire burial grounds, all sites connected to the dynasty eliminated during the Great Purge." Thorne's expression transformed from skepticism to intense focus. "Is this confirmed?" Magnus nodded without taking his eyes off Celine. "From multiple reliable sources." Celine's composure slipped further, her hands tensing against the table surface. "You're very well informed, Commander. More than I anticipated." "Why the research into extinct royalty?" Magnus pressed. "Historical curiosity seems an unlikely motivation for someone supposedly fleeing for their life." Something shifted in Celine's demeanor, a subtle straightening of her spine, a new resolve in her eyes. She made a decision in that moment. Magnus could see it happen. "The history of the Drakefire dynasty affects all werewolves, whether they acknowledge it or not," she said. "The magical bloodline that united our territories for centuries didn't simply disappear because the Ravencrofts declared it so. The imbalance created by their absence is felt throughout our world, in the constant territorial conflicts, in the failing harvests, in the increasing aggression of feral packs." Thorne laughed coldly. "You sound like a loyalist conspirator. Those fanatics have been claiming the end of the world since the Purge. Yet here we stand, stronger than ever without royal parasites feeding off our strength." "Stronger," Celine's voice took on a new edge. "Is that why the Northern Territories face food shortages for the 3rd consecutive winter? Why the Western Plains suffer unprecedented drought? Why the moon fever spreads unchecked through the southern packs. She leaned forward slightly. The royal bloodline didn't just rule Thonglin Thorn. They maintained balance with the land itself. Their magic was connected to the territories in ways the Ravencrofts could never replace with force and fear. The passion in her voice was unmistakable and dangerous. Such talk was considered sedition in many territories, particularly those under direct Ravencroft control. Even in the more independent northern territories, openly supporting restoration of the royal bloodline could be grounds for imprisonment. "You haven't answered my question," Magnus noted. "What is your personal interest in these sites? What were you looking for?" Celine hesitated, clearly calculating her response. "Proof," she finally said. "Evidence that the historical accounts of the Purge were falsified, that the Ravencroft narrative, that every member of the royal family was eliminated, might not be entirely accurate." Thorne slammed his fist on the table. "Treason! She admits to supporting restoration of the corrupt bloodline." He turned to Magnus. "We should notify the Ravencroft authorities immediately. Their bounty on loyalist agitators would bring substantial resources to Ironwood." "We're not bounty hunters, Thorne," Magnus replied coolly. "And we haven't established that she poses a direct threat to Ironwood." "Her very presence is a threat," Thorne snarled, alpha aggression leaking into his voice. "Harboring someone researching royal bloodlines could be interpreted as Ironwood supporting restoration movements. The Ravencrofts would have justification for military action against us." "The Ravencrofts look for any excuse to expand their control," Magnus countered. "I won't hand over a refugee to their tender mercies based on historical research." Thorne's face flushed with anger. "Then you leave me no choice but to bring this matter before the full council. They'll overrule this foolish compassion when they understand the risk she represents." He stood abruptly. "Detain her properly until the council convenes, and I suggest searching her thoroughly for identification marks. Loyalists often carry hidden tattoos identifying their cell affiliations." He stormed from the room, leaving Magnus alone with Celine. In the silence that followed, Magnus observed her carefully. Despite the heated exchange and Thorne's threats, she appeared relieved rather than concerned, as though Thorne's departure made the situation less dangerous rather than more. "He'll convince the council," Magnus said after a moment. "Thorne has significant influence, and fear of Ravencroft retaliation is a powerful motivator." "I'm aware of Ironwood's political dynamics," Celine replied. "Thorne has been trying to undermine your authority for years. This situation provides an opportunity to portray you as soft on security matters." Magnus raised an eyebrow. "You seem remarkably well informed about our internal politics for a southern refugee." A small smile touched her lips. "As I said, Commander, perhaps you've been asking the wrong questions." "Then answer the right one," Magnus challenged. "Who are you really, and what do you want from Ironwood?" "Protection," she said simply, "and eventually allegiance. But we're not there yet. We, those who believe the territories should be reunited under legitimate rule. Those who recognize that the current fragmented leadership is destroying our world." Magnus studied her for a long moment. "Loyalists have approached Ironwood before. We've maintained neutrality in the restoration debate, neither supporting the movement nor persecuting its members. Why come directly into our territory now, especially in such a vulnerable position?" "Because time is running out," Celine said, her voice dropping. "Grand Duke Ravencroft has discovered something, an ancient ritual called the Crimson Eclipse. If completed during the upcoming blood moon, it would allow him to absorb enough power to declare himself king with supernatural authority backing his claim." Magnus frowned. "That's impossible. The royal magic was bloodline specific." "Unless he had access to royal blood," Celine interrupted, "which he believes he soon will." The implications were disturbing. If Ravencroft had found a way to harness royal magic without the bloodline, the balance of power throughout all territories would shift dramatically, and not in Ironwood's favor. "I need to convene an emergency session of my command staff," Magnus decided. "You'll remain under guard until I determine our next steps." Celine nodded, but as Magnus rose to leave, she spoke again. "Commander Blackthorne." Something in her tone made him pause. "When the council convenes, Thorne will insist on a full examination, including a search for identifying marks on my body. It's standard procedure for suspected loyalist agents." Magnus knew she was right. The protocol for handling suspected seditionists included a physical inspection for the secret tattoos and scars that often identified their cell affiliations and rank. "It's unavoidable if you remain classified as a security risk," he acknowledged. "I understand." Her silver eyes held his steadily. But you should know that such an examination will reveal certain markings on my body that will complicate matters significantly. Loyalist tattoos? Something far more dangerous. For the first time, genuine fear flashed across her features. There's a reason I've hidden my true identity, Commander. Once revealed, there's no going back, for me or for anyone who knows. Magnus felt the weight of her words. She was offering him a choice: pursue the full security protocol, enforce whatever revelation she was hiding, or find another approach that might protect both her secrets and Ironwood's security. The council meets in 3 hours, he said finally. I'll return before then with my decision. Magnus left the interrogation room with his mind racing. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple refugee case. If Celine's warnings about Ravencroft's plans were true, Ironwood faced potential conflict regardless of how they handled her presence. If she was indeed connected to Loyalist cells, turning her over might buy temporary peace, but would compromise Ironwood's cherished independence. And if she bore markings that were even more significant than Loyalist symbols, he needed more information before the council convened. And there was only one person in Ironwood who might have deeper insight into the ancient protocols and symbols of outlawed movements. Magnus found Siu Lauthen Garrick in his private study, surrounded by ancient texts and maps. The older wolf looked up as Magnus entered, noting his troubled expression. The Omega is more than she seems, Garrick surmised. Far more, Magnus confirmed. She admitted to researching royal bloodlines and hinted at affiliation with restoration movements. Thorn is convening the council to demand she be searched for identifying marks and likely handed over to Ravencroft authorities. Garrick's weathered face darkened. Thorn has always been too eager to curry favor with the Ravencrofts. Short-sighted fool. The Omega, Celine, claims Ravencroft has discovered an ancient ritual called the Crimson Eclipse that would allow him to claim royal authority without the bloodline. The Crimson Eclipse, Garrick murmured, his expression grave. That's not common knowledge. It was purged from most historical records after the Great Purge. Magnus leaned forward. Then it's real. A theoretical ritual, described in texts predating even the Drakefire dynasty. It would require massive bloodshed, and crucially, the blood of at least one person carrying royal lineage. Garrick fixed Magnus with an intense stare. If Ravencroft is pursuing this ritual, it means he believes a royal descendant still exists. Celine said as much, and she implied that her body bears markings that would be dangerous if discovered during a security inspection. Garrick fell silent, his eyes distant with thought. Finally, he said, the royal bloodline had one unmistakable physical marker, a birthmark in the shape of a three-headed phoenix, usually appearing across the shoulders or upper back. It couldn't be falsified or hidden by normal means. Magnus felt a chill of realization. If she bears such a mark, then she is either of royal descent or has found a way to falsify the unfalsifiable. Garrick stood suddenly urgent. Magnus, if she truly bears the royal mark, you cannot allow her to be examined publicly. The consequences would be immediate and catastrophic. What would you have me do? Defy the council? Release a potential security threat? No, Garrick's voice was firm. You must examine her yourself privately before the council convenes. If she bears no royal mark, proceed with normal protocols. But if she does, he hesitated. You must be prepared to make a decision that will affect not just Ironwood, but all territories. Magnus understood the gravity of what his mentor was suggesting. As Thong Soi, he had authority to conduct preliminary security assessments without witnesses, a protocol established to protect sensitive intelligence. It would allow him to verify Celine's claim without immediately triggering wider consequences. If she bears the mark, Magnus asked quietly, what then? Garrick's eyes were solemn. Then you face the choice that comes to all great leaders eventually, between following established rules and recognizing when those rules no longer serve the greater good. Magnus left Garrick's chambers with a weight of responsibility heavier than any he'd carried during the territory wars. The next few hours could alter the course of not just Ironwood's future, but potentially all werewolf territories. He returned to the security sector and instructed the guards to prepare Interrogation Room 1, a smaller, more private space used for sensitive questioning. Unlike the intimidating environment of Room 3, this space was designed for confidential discussions with high-value assets. Bring the Omega from Room 3, he ordered. No restraints, minimal escort. This is to be handled with complete discretion. While waiting, Magnus secured the room personally, disabling surveillance equipment and ensuring privacy. Whatever happened next would remain between him and Celine, until he determined the appropriate course of action. She entered moments later, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes betrayed surprise at the change of venue. The council convenes in less than 2 hours, Magnus said without preamble. Before then, I need to verify your claim about identifying markings. This is a private security assessment authorized under my authority as Thong Soai. Understanding dawned in her silver eyes. You wish to examine me privately rather than before the council. It seems the prudent first step. Celine studied him for a long moment, as though assessing his intentions and character. Finally, she nodded. Very well, Commander Blackthorn. But understand that what I show you cannot be unseen. The knowledge comes with obligation. I've carried the weight of obligation since I was 18, Magnus replied evenly. One more won't break me. We shall see. Celine turned her back to him and slowly, deliberately lowered the top portion of her gray garment to expose her shoulders and upper back. Magnus's breath caught in his throat. Across her pale skin, stretching from shoulder to shoulder, was an intricate birthmark in the unmistakable shape of a three-headed phoenix. The central head faced forward, while the outer heads turned outward, wings spreading across her shoulder blades. The mark seemed to shimmer slightly in the light, as though infused with something more than mere pigmentation. It was exactly as Garrick had described, the royal mark that had adorned the Drakefire bloodline for 27 generations. A mark that, according to official history, had been erased from existence during the Great Purge. By the ancient moon, Magnus whispered, the formal oath slipping out unbidden. His world tilted on its axis as implications cascaded through his mind. Celine, or whatever her true name was, turned to face him, her garment still lowered to reveal the upper portion of the mark wrapping around her collarbone. Her silver eyes, the distinctive eye color of the royal line, held his steadily. Now you understand, she said quietly. I am Alexandra Drakefire, rightful queen of the United Territories, last surviving heir of the royal bloodline that ruled for 9 centuries before the Great Purge. And you, Magnus Blackthorn, have just committed high treason by allowing me to live after confirming my identity. Magnus stood frozen, caught in a moment that would forever divide his life into before and after. Everything he knew about the world order, about history, about his own place in it, shifted beneath his feet like ice breaking apart in spring thaw. Alexandra Drakefire, the lost princess, the child supposedly executed alongside her parents during the Palace Massacre 20 years ago. The focal point of restoration movements and loyalist dreams for a generation, alive and standing before him. The penalty for harboring royal blood is death, she continued, her voice steady. Not just for me, but for anyone who discovers my identity and fails to report it. Your Thong Lin Thorn would hand me to the Ravencrofts without hesitation. How? Magnus finally found his voice. How did you survive? Every historical account confirms the entire royal family was executed. History is written by victors, Alexandra echoed Garrick's earlier words. A loyal guard smuggled me from the palace during the massacre. I was raised in secrecy, moving between loyalist safe houses, my identity known only to a handful of protectors who gave their lives to keep me alive. She pulled her garment back up, covering the damning mark. For 20 years, I've lived as a ghost while the territories crumbled under Ravencroft rule. I've watched our people suffer through wars, famine, and disease because the natural order was broken. The land itself rebels against false leadership. Magnus's tactical mind raced ahead, processing the security implications. Ravencroft's hunt for royal blood, the Crimson Eclipse ritual, he knows you exist. Alexandra nodded grimly. There was a breach in our security 6 months ago. My location was compromised, forcing me to flee my sanctuary. I've been moving between territories since then, always one step ahead of Ravencroft's hunters, gathering allies where I can. Why Ironwood? Magnus demanded. Coming here puts us all at risk. Because Ironwood is the last major territory with genuine independence from Ravencroft influence. Because your military might is respected enough to deter immediate attack. And because you, Magnus Blackthorn, have a reputation for placing honor above politics. Her silver eyes held his. I need allies if I'm to survive long enough to challenge Ravencroft's claim on the territories. The council bell rang in the distance, signaling 1 hour until the emergency session. Time was running out for Magnus to decide a course of action. The council will demand answers, he said, thinking aloud. Thorn already suspects you're connected to loyalist movements. A full examination would reveal your identity instantly. Enforce your hand, Alexandra agreed. Either declare for me and face Ravencroft's wrath, or hand me over and secure temporary peace at the cost of Ironwood's soul. Magnus paced the small room, weighing impossible options. His duty to Ironwood's security had always been clear: protect the territory from threats, maintain neutrality in the larger territorial conflicts, ensure the survival of his people above all else. But if Alexandra's claims about the Crimson Eclipse were true, neutrality was no longer an option. Ravencroft would come for Ironwood eventually, royal heir or not. I need time, he decided. Time to verify your claims about Ravencroft's plans, to consult with trusted advisors, to prepare Ironwood for the storm that will come, regardless of my choice. Alexandra watched him closely. The council meets in less than an hour, Commander. Thorn will demand immediate action. Magnus stopped, pacing, decision crystallizing. Then we give him what he wants, but on our terms. He outlined his plan quickly, a calculated risk that might buy them precious time without immediately exposing Alexandra's royal identity or committing Ironwood to open defiance of Ravencroft authority. When the council convened 30 minutes later, the chamber hummed with tension. 12 elders sat in a semicircle with Thonglin Thorn positioned prominently among them. Sulaut and Garrick occupied the honored seat at the center, his presence as former leader giving weight to the proceedings. Magnus stood before them, his military bearing impeccable despite the turbulence in his mind. Behind him, 4 guards escorted Alexandra into the chamber. She appeared appropriately subdued, eyes downcast in a convincing display of Omega deference that Magnus now recognized as masterful acting. Thong Soi Blackthorn, Elder Garrick began formally. You've been summoned to address security concerns regarding the Omega refugee currently in Ironwood custody. Thonglin Thorn has raised serious allegations regarding potential connections to seditious movements. What say you to these concerns? Magnus stepped forward, his voice clear and commanding. Honorable Council, I've conducted a thorough security assessment of the individual in question. Based on extensive interrogation and physical examination, I can confirm she bears identification markings consistent with Loyalist affiliation. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Thorn leaned forward, triumph gleaming in his eyes. However, Magnus continued, the specific markings and intelligence she has provided indicate she is not a common Loyalist agitator, but a high-value intelligence asset who has infiltrated their ranks. Confusion replaced triumph on Thorn's face. Explain yourself, Commander. The Omega known as Selene has been working to gather intelligence on Loyalist cells throughout the territories. The markings on her body were applied as part of her deep cover operation. More significantly, she has provided critical information regarding an imminent threat to all northern territories, including Ironwood. Magnus proceeded to outline the threat of the Crimson Eclipse ritual, carefully framing it as intelligence gathered by Selene rather than first-hand knowledge. He described Ravencroft's plans to consolidate power through ancient magic, positioning it as a threat to Ironwood's sovereignty rather than a restoration issue. Given the sensitive nature of this intelligence and the value of this asset, I am invoking Thong Sooshi's privilege to place her under my direct protection for continued debriefing, Magnus concluded. Her knowledge may be crucial to Ironwood's security in the coming months. Thorn shot to his feet. This is unprecedented. An unknown Omega suddenly appears with tales of ancient rituals and Ravencroft plots, and you propose granting her protected status? The Council must verify these claims independently, including examination of these supposed markings she bears. The markings have been documented according to protocol, Magnus countered smoothly. The verification files are available to Council members with appropriate security clearance. A lie, but one that would take time to discover, time they desperately needed. Garrick's weathered face revealed nothing as he studied Magnus. After a weighted silence, he spoke. Thong Soi's privilege is rarely invoked, but remains the commander's right in matters of immediate security concern. His eyes shifted to Thorn. Unless you wish to formally challenge the Thong Soi's judgment in military matters? It was a pointed reminder of boundaries. While the Council governs civic matters, military authority remained firmly with the Thong Soi. A formal challenge would require Thorn to prove military competence he didn't possess. Thorn's jaw clenched. I withdraw the challenge, but register my protest. This Omega's presence creates unnecessary risk. If Ravencroft forces learned we harbor a known Loyalist asset, they would learn nothing they don't already suspect, Magnus interrupted. Ironwood's neutrality has long been a thorn in Ravencroft's side. This intelligence gives us advance warning of threats we already face. The debate continued for another hour, with council members questioning various aspects of Magnus's assessment. Throughout, Alexandra maintained her role perfectly, deferential, nervous, exactly as an Omega informant might appear before hostile authority figures. Finally, Elder Garrick called her for a vote. By a narrow margin of 7-5, the council accepted Magnus's recommendation to place Selene under protected asset status, with the provision that a full report be provided within 14 days. As the council dispersed, Thorne approached Magnus, voice low with barely contained fury. "This isn't over, Blackthorn. There's more to this Omega than you're admitting. When the truth emerges, and it will, remember that you placed her above Ironwood's safety." "I've always put Ironwood first," Magnus replied evenly, "which is why I recognize genuine threats from political posturing." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "We'll see how genuine your judgment is when Ravencroft forces march on our borders." He stalked away, already deep in conversation with two allied council members. Garrick intercepted Magnus before he could leave the chamber, his expression grave. "You've bought time, but at considerable cost. Thorne will not rest until he uncovers the full truth." "Time is all we need," Magnus replied quietly. "Enough to verify her claims and prepare our response." Garrick glanced at Alexandra, still flanked by guards across the chamber. "You've set yourself on a dangerous path, Magnus. The line between protection and treason has never been thinner." "Sometimes duty requires walking dangerous paths," Magnus answered, meeting his mentor's gaze steadily. "You taught me that." A ghost of a smile touched Garrick's lips. "So I did. I hope I also taught you to watch for daggers at your back. Thorne will move against you now, convinced you have been compromised." "Let him try." The guards escorted Alexandra back to secured quarters, not the interrogation room or holding cell, but private accommodations befitting a protected intelligence asset. As they walked, Magnus contemplated the impossible situation he now faced. He had committed his first act of deception against the council he was sworn to serve, all on the word of a woman who claimed royal blood and promised only conflict ahead. Yet as he recalled the royal mark on her skin, the mark that couldn't be falsified, he knew he'd made the only choice his conscience would allow. The coming days would test not just his judgment, but the very foundations of everything he had fought to protect. They had gained 14 days before the council would demand answers. 14 days to determine whether Alexandra Drakefire represented Ironwood's salvation or its destruction. 14 days before Magnus would be forced to choose between the oath he had sworn to his territory and a truth that could reshape the world. As if sensing his thoughts, Alexandra glanced back at him, silver eyes meeting his with a silent acknowledgement of the bond now forged between them, a dangerous alliance born of secrets and necessity that would either save them both or condemn them together. The truth has a weight all its own. Magnus felt it pressing down on his shoulders as he strode through the torch-lit corridors of Ironwood's eastern wing, where Alexandra Drakefire, the last royal heir, the living ghost of a bloodline thought extinguished, now resided under his protection. 14 days. He had bought them 14 precious days before the council would demand answers he wasn't prepared to give. The guards posted outside her quarters straightened as he approached, fists pressed to chests in salute. Magnus had selected these men personally, veterans from his own combat unit during the territory wars, soldiers whose loyalty to him superseded their political allegiances. Even so, he had told them nothing of Alexandra's true identity. That knowledge remained confined to just 3 people, himself, Alexandra, and Thane Garrick. "Has she had any visitors?" Magnus asked the senior guard. "Only the healer Eleanor, as authorized, sir. Brought food and fresh clothing." Magnus nodded. "I'll be inside for some time. No interruptions unless it's an emergency." The guard unlocked the heavy wooden door, revealing quarters that, while secure, offered considerably more comfort than a detention cell. A modest but well-appointed sitting area opened to a bedroom and private bathing chamber. The windows, though reinforced with iron latticework, provided a view of the snow-covered forests beyond Ironwood's walls. Alexandra stood by one of these windows, her silhouette outlined against the pale winter light. She had been provided with clothing more befitting her supposed status as a high-value intelligence asset. Simple but well-made garments in Ironwood's colors of deep green and silver. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, revealing the elegant line of her neck. She turned at his entrance, silver eyes assessing him with that unnerving directness he was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "Commander Blackthorn," she greeted, her voice carefully modulated. Even in private, she maintained the charade, aware that walls could have ears. "I hope you bring news of progress." Magnus closed the door and moved to the center of the room. We need to talk. Openly. Alexandra tilted her head slightly, listening for something beyond his words. After a moment, she crossed to the small desk near the window and retrieved a carved wooden figurine, a wolf with intricate runes etched into its surface. She placed it on the table between them. A privacy ward, she explained, noting his questioning look. A gift from Eleanor. It creates interference for anyone attempting to eavesdrop, magical or otherwise. Magnus raised an eyebrow. Eleanor gave you this? Does she know? No. She believes I'm exactly what you told the council, a deep cover intelligence asset, but she's observant enough to recognize that our conversations might require privacy. A small smile touched her lips. You inspire strong loyalty in your people, Commander. They trust your judgment, even when they don't understand your decisions. Some do, Magnus corrected grimly. Others are already questioning my sanity. Thorn has been gathering support, hinting to council members that I've been compromised by an Omega's influence. Alexandra's expression hardened. An antiquated prejudice, using my designation to discredit your judgment. An effective tactic nonetheless. Magnus paced the small room, military habits asserting themselves as he organized his thoughts. We have 14 days before I must present a full report to the council. 14 days to either verify your claims about the Crimson Eclipse ritual and Ravencroft's plans, or surrender me to the Ravencrofts and secure a temporary peace. Alexandra finished when he hesitated. That's not an option I'm considering. The firmness in his own voice surprised him. When had he made that decision? Perhaps the moment he'd seen the royal mark on her skin, or perhaps during the council meeting when he'd chosen deception over betrayal. But I need more than your word to convince the council. I need proof of Ravencroft's plans, evidence solid enough to justify protecting you. Alexandra nodded, sinking gracefully into one of the room's 2 chairs. There's a loyalist cell in Ironwood territory. A small group, but connected to the larger network. They've been gathering intelligence on Ravencroft's movements for months, including his search for the ritual components. You want me to contact known seditionists? Magnus's voice was incredulous. I want you to gather intelligence from a valuable source, she countered. Information that could protect Ironwood, regardless of your decision about me. Magnus studied her for a long moment. Her suggestion made tactical sense, yet it represented another step into treacherous territory. Officially sanctioning contact with loyalists would be viewed by many as explicit support for restoration efforts, exactly the pretext Ravencroft needed to move against Ironwood. How would I find this cell? Loyalists are notoriously cautious, especially in territories with standing armies. Alexandra's silver eyes met his. You already know their leader quite well, Commander. You've broken bread with him repeatedly over the years. Understanding dawned. Garrick. A slight nod confirmed his suspicion. He's been coordinating loyalist activities in the Northern Territories for over a decade, preparing for the possibility that a royal heir might one day be found. The revelation shouldn't have surprised him. Garrick had always maintained a careful neutrality in public discussions of restoration, neither condemning nor supporting the movement. But in private, he had occasionally hinted at dissatisfaction with the fragmented rule that followed the Great Purge. Still, to learn that his mentor, the man who had trained him and eventually chosen him as successor, had been leading a secret resistance movement for years. He never told me, Magnus said, an edge of betrayal in his voice. He couldn't risk your position or Ironwood's safety. Alexandra leaned forward slightly. The fewer who knew, the safer you all were. But now circumstances have changed. The Crimson Eclipse ritual approaches with the blood moon, and Ravencroft grows desperate to find me. How desperate? Desperate enough to risk open warfare. Her voice dropped. 3 days ago, he deployed his elite hunters to the border territories with orders to search every settlement, every sanctuary, regardless of territorial sovereignty. They have already executed 17 suspected loyalists in public demonstrations. How do you know this? Magnus demanded, his tactical mind already calculating defensive scenarios. The Loyalist Network, she replied simply. They've been my eyes and ears for years, my protection when hunters drew too close. Magnus fell silent, processing the implications. If what Alexandra said was true, and he had no reason to doubt her on this point, Ravencroft's forces were already violating territorial boundaries. The 14 days he'd secured from the council might prove insufficient if Ravencroft's hunters reach Ironwood territory before then. I need to meet with Garrick, he decided. Not as Thong Soi consulting an elder, but as a military commander speaking with a resistance leader. I need to understand exactly what we're facing, what intelligence he has, and what resources might be available. Alexandra nodded. He'll tell you what he knows. She hesitated, then added, there's something else you should be aware of, Commander, something that may prove useful in the coming days. Go on. The royal bloodline carried certain abilities. You know this from historical records, I'm sure. Pyrokinesis, enhanced telepathic connections, the ability to suppress another werewolf shift. Abilities that made the royal family nearly impossible to overthrow for generations, Magnus noted, until the Ravencrofts developed silver-based weapons that could neutralize werewolf magic. Yes, but those accounts are incomplete. Alexandra rose and moved toward him, her posture shifting subtly. The most significant ability of the royal bloodline wasn't offensive, but defensive, our connection to the land itself, to the natural energy that flows through all territories. This connection manifests differently in each generation. In my case, she extended her hand, palm up. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, like mist gathering over a mountain lake at dawn, energy began to coalesce above her palm, first translucent, then taking on a golden hue until it formed a small, flickering flame that burned without fuel or heat. Pyrokinesis, Magnus murmured, fascinated despite himself. The fire-shaping ability mentioned in the old texts. Alexandra closed her fingers, extinguishing the flame. A minor manifestation, the true power lies in what the flame represents. Direct connection to the primal energies that sustain our territories. In the presence of a true ruler, the land flourishes. Game becomes plentiful, harvests abundant, pack bonds stronger. Under false rule, the land withers, just as we've seen since the Purge. And this connection, this power, is what Ravencroft hopes to steal through the Crimson Eclipse ritual. He hopes to corrupt it, to bend it to his will rather than serve as its steward. Anger flashed in her silver eyes. He doesn't understand that the power isn't meant to dominate, but to nurture, to maintain balance. If he succeeds, he won't restore prosperity. He'll accelerate the decline, perhaps irreparably. The conviction in her voice was absolute, and in that moment, Magnus glimpsed something beyond the poised, calculating survivor he'd come to know over the past 2 days. There was a deeper passion, a sense of duty and purpose that transcended mere desire for restoration of her birthright. Alexandra Drakefire truly believed her bloodline served the territories rather than ruling them, a perspective at odds with the tyrannical portrayal in post-Purge histories. I need to see Garrick, Magnus repeated, his decision crystallizing. Tonight, after the evening patrols change. Less chance of being observed. Alexandra nodded. Be cautious. Thorn will have eyes watching your movements. I've evaded better surveillance than anything Thorn could organize, Magnus replied with a grim smile. The skills that had kept him alive through a decade of territorial conflicts hadn't dulled with his administrative responsibilities. As he turned to leave, Alexandra called after him. Commander. He paused, looking back. I know what I'm asking of you, the position I've put you in. If there had been any other option. She trailed off, and for the first time, he saw genuine regret in her expression. We make our choices and live with the consequences, Magnus said simply. I made mine when I saw the royal mark. Now we move forward, whatever comes. Night had fallen by the time Magnus left the fortress, a hooded cloak concealing his distinctive silver-streaked hair as he moved through Ironwood's outer settlement. He had dismissed his usual guards, citing personal business, and taken a circuitous route through the labyrinthine storage cellars that honeycombed the ground beneath the fortress, passages known to few outside the military command. Garrick's personal dwelling stood apart from the main settlement, a sturdy stone cottage nestled against the edge of the ancient forest that gave Ironwood its name. No guards patrolled here. Despite his status as former Thong Soai and respected elder, Garrick maintained the humble appearance of a retired warrior seeking quiet contemplation in his later years. A facade, Magnus now realized, that had concealed years of clandestine resistance activity. He approached from before us, avoiding the main path and rapped softly on the rear door in a pattern they had used during military campaigns. 3 quick taps, pause, 2 slower taps. The door opened immediately as though Garrick had been waiting. You took your time, the older wolf commented, ushering Magnus inside. I expected you yesterday. The interior of the cottage belied its rustic exterior. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with ancient texts and scrolls. A large table dominated the main room, covered with maps and documents. An enchanted fire burned in the hearth, giving off warmth but no smoke that might be detected from outside. "You've been busy," Magnus observed, taking in the obvious signs of resistance planning. "For many years." Garrick secured the door and activated a privacy ward similar to the one Alexandra had used. A carved wolf figure placed prominently on the mantel. "I assume our royal guest has revealed my other role." "Loyalist cell leader," Magnus confirmed, removing his cloak. "A significant detail to have omitted from our previous conversations, old friend." Garrick's weathered face showed no remorse. "Some secrets are necessary even among allies. Until 2 days ago, knowing of my loyalist connections would have placed you in an impossible position. I protected you by keeping you ignorant. And now? Now you've made your choice." Garrick gestured to a chair. "You wouldn't be here otherwise." Magnus remained standing. "I haven't chosen sides in a restoration conflict. I've chosen to protect a refugee with valuable intelligence about threats to Ironwood's security. There's a distinction." A knowing smile touched Garrick's lips. "A convenient distinction, politically. But we both know what the royal mark means. Alexandra Drakefire's very existence changes everything. For Ironwood, for the territories, for you personally." "What I need," Magnus said, steering the conversation to practical matters, "is evidence. Proof of Ravencroft's plans that I can present to the council. Something tangible enough to justify protecting Alexandra beyond the 14 days I've secured." "Ah, evidence." Garrick moved to a locked chest in the corner of the room. Always the strategist, focusing on the next tactical objective. He produced an ancient iron key from within his robes and unlocked the chest. "Perhaps this will satisfy your need for tangible proof." From within, he withdrew a scroll sealed with black wax bearing the unmistakable crest of House Ravencroft, a raven clutching a crown in its talons. "Intercepted 4 days ago by our operatives in the Eastern Territories. A communique from Grand Duke Ravencroft to his military commanders, detailing preparations for the Crimson Eclipse ritual." Magnus took the scroll carefully, breaking the seal to examine its contents. The document was written in cipher, but one he recognized from military intelligence briefings, a code used by Ravencroft's inner circle. "You can read it?" Garrick asked. "Enough to understand the significance." Magnus scanned the text with growing concern. "He's mobilizing his elite units, positioning them along all major territorial boundaries. Preparation for aggressive expansion once the ritual is complete." He looked up sharply. "These troop movements alone could be considered acts of war." "Precisely why we intercepted this particular communication," Garrick agreed. "It provides justification for defensive preparations, regardless of one's position on restoration." Magnus continued writing, his expression darkening. "The ritual components. Blood of the last royal heir, gathered during the blood moon at the ancient throne site. Sacrifices from each territory to bind their essence to his will." He looked up. "This is madness. Even if he captured Alexandra, this ritual would devastate the territories." "Now you begin to understand the true threat." Garrick's voice was grim. "This isn't merely about who sits upon a symbolic throne. It's about the fundamental balance of our world. If Ravencroft completes this ritual, he won't just rule the territories. He'll drain them of life to fuel his own power." Magnus carefully resealed the scroll. "This will help convince some council members, but not all. Thorn and his faction will claim it's a loyalist forgery. Then we need more than documents." Garrick's eyes gleamed with purpose. "We need to demonstrate the truth in a way no one can deny." "How?" "Through the Runanga ritual." Magnus stared at him. "The ancient trial that hasn't been conducted in generations." The Runanga was one of the oldest traditions among werewolves, predating even the Drakefire dynasty. A sacred trial where pack members could challenge accusations or prove claims by undertaking a spiritual journey guided by ancestral magic. During the ritual, participants entered a trance state where deception was impossible, where one's very essence was exposed to judgment by the ancient spirits that watched over all werewolves. False claims resulted in severe punishment, often death, as the spirits turned against the deceiver. "The ritual would prove Alexandra's identity beyond any doubt," Garrick said. "No loyalist forgery, no Omega manipulation, just the incontrovertible truth of her bloodline, witnessed by representatives from the council." "It's too dangerous," Magnus objected. "The ritual exposes participants completely. If Thorn or his allies were present, they'd learn everything, not just Alexandra's identity, but our knowledge of it, your loyalist connections, all of it. Not if we control who witnesses the ritual. Garrick leaned forward. As Thong Soi, you have the authority to convene a special security assessment with only key council representatives present. Select those who might be swayed by irrefutable evidence, those whose loyalty to Ironwood outweighs political allegiances. The idea was audacious, potentially transformative, and incredibly risky. If it succeeded, Alexandra's claim would be validated by the most sacred tradition of their people. If it failed, and if the spirits reject her, Magnus asked, voicing the unthinkable, if she somehow falsified the royal mark, or if her bloodline is tainted in ways we don't understand, then we'll have our answer as well, Garrick replied solemnly. But I've studied the historical accounts of royal heirs for decades. The mark she bears cannot be falsified. The silver eyes, the connection to primal energies, these are birthright traits that cannot be mimicked. Magnus considered the proposal carefully. The Renanga ritual was revered across all territories, its validity unquestioned even by those who rejected restoration. If Alexandra submitted to the trial and emerged validated, it would provide the evidence he needed, not just for the council, but for his own certainty. I'll discuss it with her, he decided. The choice must be hers. The ritual carries significant risk, especially for one with royal blood. The exposure could leave her vulnerable to magical tracking by Ravencroft's hunters. True, but it may be the only way to secure Ironwood's support before Ravencroft's forces arrive at our borders. Garrick moved to a map spread across the table, pointing to marked positions. Our intelligence suggests his hunters will reach our outer territories within 10 days. The blood moon rises in 22. Our window for decisive action narrows by the hour. Magnus memorized the marked positions, his military mind automatically calculating defensive scenarios, troop deployments, resource allocations. If conflict came, when it came, Ironwood needed to be prepared. Regardless of Alexandra's identity or claim to rule, the threat Ravencroft posed was real and immediate. There's one more thing you should know, Garrick said, his tone shifting subtly. Something I've kept from you, not out of distrust, but from an abundance of caution. More secrets, old friend? Magnus raised an eyebrow. This one dates back to the territory wars. Garrick's expression grew solemn. To the night your patrol was ambushed in the southern pass. The night you lost 16 men to what you believed was an Omega's betrayal. Magnus went still, memories of that blood-soaked night flooding back. The youngest members of his unit, slaughtered in an ambush after their position was revealed by an Omega scout they'd rescued days earlier. It had been the defining trauma of his military career, the source of his distrust toward Omegas, the scar that had never fully healed. What about it? His voice was dangerously quiet. The Omega wasn't a traitor, Garrick said carefully. She was a loyalist operative attempting to reach a safe house with information about surviving members of the royal bloodline. The ambush was orchestrated by Ravencroft hunters who had been tracking her for weeks. Your patrol was collateral damage in their attempt to capture her. The revelation hit Magnus like a physical blow. For 15 years, he had carried the weight of that failure, the guilt of trusting too easily, the bitterness of betrayal. It had shaped his approach to command, his careful vetting of intelligence, his reluctance to trust outsiders. How long have you known this? He demanded. I learned the full truth about 5 years ago when I took over the Northern Loyalist Network. Garrick met his gaze steadily. By then, the narrative was too deeply embedded in your history, your identity as a commander. Revealing it seemed more likely to cause harm than healing. You had no right to withhold this. Anger simmered beneath Magnus's controlled exterior. Those were my men, my responsibility. And you've honored their memory by becoming the finest commander Ironwood has ever known, Garrick countered. Would knowing the truth then have changed that path? Or would it have pulled you into the restoration conflict before you were ready to choose sides? Magnus had no answer. The past could not be rewritten. The dead could not be returned to life. Yet the revelation shifted something fundamental in his understanding of himself, his history, his instinctive distrust of Omegas like Alexandra. Why tell me now, he finally asked. Because you need to understand the true nature of our enemy, Garrick replied. Ravencroft's forces have manipulated events, created false narratives, turned natural allies against each other for generations. The divide between those who support restoration and those who fear it is largely manufactured, a tactic to keep the territories fragmented and weak. Magnus absorbed this, his tactical mind connecting previously disparate elements into a more coherent picture. The persistent territorial conflicts, the resource scarcity that defied logical explanation, the increasing aggression of feral packs, all symptoms of the imbalance Alexandra had described. "I need time to process this," he said finally, retrieving his cloak, "and to discuss the Runanga ritual with Alexandra. If she agrees, how soon could it be arranged?" 3 days to prepare the sacred space and gather the necessary components. Another day to select and summon the witnesses. Garrick hesitated. "There's one more complication. The ritual requires a spiritual guide, someone with the ancient knowledge to navigate the boundary between physical and spiritual realms. I assume you have someone in mind?" "Eleanor Frost." Magnus's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Eleanor? She's a healer, not a spiritual guide." "She's both," Garrick corrected. "Her family has maintained the old ways for generations, preserving knowledge of spiritual practices that predated even the royal bloodline. Few know of her deeper abilities, a necessary precaution in these times." First Garrick, now Eleanor. How many of those Magnus trusted had been living double lives, maintaining facades while pursuing restoration goals? The realization was unsettling, suggesting a level of coordinated activity beneath Ironwood's seemingly stable surface that he, as Thong Soai, had failed to detect. "I'll speak with Alexandra tonight and Eleanor tomorrow," Magnus decided. "If both agree, we'll proceed with preparations for the ritual." But Garrick, he fixed his mentor with an intense stare. "No more secrets. If we're to navigate what's coming, I need complete transparency. My men's lives will depend on it." Garrick inclined his head in acknowledgement. "No more secrets relevant to our current situation. You have my word." It was the best Magnus could expect. Some secrets weren't Garrick's to share, and the Loyalist network had survived through careful compartmentalization of information. But the qualified promise was still more than he had before. Magnus departed as cautiously as he had arrived, taking a different route back to the fortress. The night was clear and cold, stars glittering like shards of ice in the black sky. The moon, waxing toward fullness, cast enough light to navigate without torches, a blessing for a solitary figure wishing to move unnoticed. He was halfway to the fortress when his instincts flared. Someone was following him, moving with the practiced stealth of a trained hunter, but detectable to Magnus's heightened senses. He continued walking normally, giving no indication he'd noticed the pursuit, while his mind calculated options. Not a routine patrol, they would have challenged him directly. Not an assassin, they would have attacked at the edge of the forest where witnesses were scarce. This was surveillance, someone tracking his movements. Thorne's people, most likely. The political rival wouldn't waste time establishing a network to monitor Magnus's activities, especially after the controversial council decision regarding Alexandra. Magnus turned down a narrow alley between storage buildings, then abruptly scaled the rough stone wall of the nearest structure, positioning himself flat against the rooftop. Moments later, a cloaked figure entered the alley, moving cautiously. Even with the hood obscuring their features, Magnus recognized the distinctive posture of Lieutenant Coda, one of Thorne's most trusted soldiers. So Thorne was already gathering intelligence, documenting Magnus's suspicious activities. The visit to Garrick would be reported, though without knowledge of what was discussed. It confirmed what Magnus had already suspected. The 14-day reprieve was largely symbolic. Thorne was building his case against both Magnus and Alexandra, preparing to challenge the Thong Soai's judgment before the full council. Time was becoming an increasingly precious commodity. Magnus waited until Coda had passed beneath his position, then dropped silently behind him. Before the lieutenant could react, Magnus had him pinned against the wall, one hand covering his mouth. "Reporting to Thorne becomes difficult without a tongue," Magnus said softly, his tone conversational despite the implicit threat. "Consider carefully what details you share from tonight's excursion." Fear flashed in Coda's eyes, quickly masked by defiance. When Magnus removed his hand, the lieutenant spoke with strained composure. "The Thong Lin has concerns about your recent decisions, Commander. He acts for Ironwood's security." "No, he acts for his own ambition." Magnus stepped back, releasing Coda but maintaining an intimidating presence. "Remind him that surveillance of the Thong Soai without council authorization is itself a serious offense, one I've chosen to overlook. This time. He'll want to know why you visited Garrick at such a late hour," Coda said, straightening his cloak. Secret meetings with a council elder look suspicious when you've just invoked Thong Soai's privilege. Garrick was my commanding officer and mentor for 20 years, Magnus replied evenly. We discuss military matters regularly. Nothing in our conversation tonight threatens Ironwood's security, unlike Thorne's unauthorized surveillance of military command. The implicit counter-accusation hung between them. Koda was intelligent enough to recognize the precarious position he now occupied, caught spying on the Thong Soai, facing potential charges if Magnus chose to pursue them. I'll deliver your message, he said stiffly. Good, now go. And Lieutenant, Magnus's voice hardened. Don't follow me again. Next time I won't be so understanding. He watched Koda retreat down the alley before continuing toward the fortress. The encounter confirmed that his time frame had contracted even further. If Thorne was already deploying surveillance, more aggressive moves would follow soon, perhaps challenges before the full council, demands for independent examination of Alexandra, inquiries into Magnus's handling of the situation. The Runanga ritual needed to happen quickly before Thorne could marshal enough support to force the issue, and before Ravencroft's hunters reached Ironwood territory. Magnus found Alexandra awake when he returned to her quarters, despite the late hour. She sat cross-legged on the floor near the hearth, eyes closed in meditation. The small flame he'd seen earlier hovered above her upturned palm, pulsing gently like a living heart. She sensed his presence immediately, opening her silver eyes while maintaining the flame. You spoke with Garrick. Yes. Magnus removed his cloak, hanging it near the door. He suggests the Runanga ritual to validate your identity before select council members. It would provide the evidence I need to extend your protection indefinitely. The flame flickered and vanished as Alexandra uncrossed her legs and rose with fluid grace. The Runanga hasn't been performed in generations. Few remain who know the proper protocols. Apparently, Eleanor Frost is one such person. Garrick believes she can guide the ritual successfully. Alexandra moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit forest. The ritual would expose me completely, not just my identity, but my memories, my intentions, my connections to loyalist networks. Anyone witnessing would learn everything, which is why we would carefully select the witnesses, Magnus explained. Only those council members most likely to prioritize Ironwood's security over political allegiances. And if they still choose to reject me, if they decide Ironwood's interests are best served by surrendering me to Ravencroft, the question hung between them, unavoidable and crucial. Magnus had been considering it since leaving Garrick's cottage. His duty as Thong Soai was to protect Ironwood above all else. If the council, even a select group of its most trusted members, determined that Alexandra's presence posed too great a risk, I would honor their decision, he said finally, the words heavy with implication. Officially. Alexandra turned from the window, her gaze searching his face. And unofficially? Preparations would be made for your departure from Ironwood territory via secure routes. You would have supplies, weapons, and guidance to the nearest loyalist safe house beyond our borders. The plan formed as he spoke, military precision applying itself to a potential extraction scenario. Officially, you would have escaped custody during transfer to Ravencroft authorities. An unfortunate security lapse that would be investigated thoroughly. A small smile curved her lips. You've already thought this through. It's my job to consider contingencies, even those that involve treason, especially those. Magnus met her gaze steadily, but I believe the ritual offers a better outcome. If the spirits validate your claim, if council members witness that validation, we gain valuable allies within Ironwood's leadership. The division Ravencroft has cultivated between Restoration supporters and opponents begins to heal. Alexandra was silent for a long moment, weighing her options. The Runanga ritual represented both opportunity and terrible risk. Success would provide the foundation for legitimate resistance against Ravencroft's plans. Failure or betrayal by those witnessing would leave her more vulnerable than ever. When I was a child, she said finally, hiding in safe houses, constantly moving to avoid detection, I dreamed of the day I would stand before my people and be recognized for who I am. Not for power or privilege, but because recognition meant I could finally fulfill the duty I was born to, restoring balance to our lands. Her silver eyes met his. If the Runanga offers that possibility, I must accept the risk. You understand what it entails? The complete exposure, the vulnerability during the trance state? She nodded. I've studied the ancient texts. The ritual strips away all deception, all masks. Those witnessing, will see the truth of my bloodline, my experiences, my intentions. A wry smile touched her lips. Fortunately, I have nothing to hide regarding my claim or my purpose. My fears concern what others might do with that knowledge. I'll select the witnesses carefully, Magnus assured her, and security will be absolute. Then I consent to the Runanga. Alexandra's decision carried the weight of royal authority, a glimpse of the queen she might become if their gamble succeeded. How soon can it be arranged? 4 days, according to Garrick. Time to prepare the sacred space and gather necessary components. Magnus didn't mention his encounter with Thorne's spy, not wanting to add to her concerns. I'll speak with Eleanor tomorrow to confirm her willingness to serve as spiritual guide. Alexandra nodded, then hesitated before asking, "And what of you, Commander? The ritual will expose not just me, but anyone closely connected to me. Your knowledge of my identity, your decisions since discovering it, all will be visible to those witnessing." It was a consideration Magnus had already weighed. His actions, since discovering Alexandra's royal mark, could easily be interpreted as treason by those inclined to view them in the worst light. The ritual would reveal his deception before the council, his private contingency plans, his growing doubt about the historical narrative he'd been raised to believe. "I've survived worse scrutiny," he said simply. "My duty is to Ironwood's security. If protecting you serves that purpose, and I believe it does, then I'm prepared to defend that decision before any audience, spiritual or otherwise." The answer seemed to satisfy her. "Then we proceed. 4 days to prepare for the Runanga." She moved closer, her expression solemn. "Whatever comes after, Commander Blackthorn, know that your protection these past days has not been forgotten. If I reclaim my birthright, Ironwood will have no more loyal ally than the Northern Throne. Let's focus on surviving the ritual before contemplating alliances between kingdoms," Magnus replied pragmatically. "One battle at a time." The hint of a smile touched her lips. "Always the military commander." She inclined her head slightly. "Rest well, Magnus Blackthorn. The coming days will demand strength from us both." Magnus nodded in acknowledgement and departed, instructing the guards to maintain their vigilance throughout the night. As he walked the torch-lit corridors toward his own quarters, he found himself reflecting on the extraordinary path that had opened before him since Alexandra's arrival. In less than 3 days, he had gone from Ironwood's loyal Thong Soi to a man contemplating treason if circumstances required it, from military commander to potential kingmaker, or king's executioner, if the Runanga revealed deception. He could not afford to forget that possibility, however unlikely it seemed. Alexandra's royal mark appeared genuine, her abilities consistent with historical accounts of the bloodline, her knowledge of secret histories too detailed to be fabrication. But if the ritual revealed otherwise, if she had somehow manufactured an elaborate deception, Magnus would need to act decisively to protect Ironwood from both her machinations and Ravencroft's ambitions. One battle at a time indeed. Morning brought a summons from the council. Not the full assembly, but an informal gathering of 3 influential elders requesting the Thong Soi's presence to discuss security matters. Magnus recognized the political maneuvering immediately. Thorne was beginning to apply pressure, using his allies to probe Magnus's resolve and gather information about Alexandra. He attended the meeting with calm professionalism, answering questions about the intelligence asset with carefully constructed half-truths. Yes, she remained in protective custody. Yes, initial debriefing had yielded valuable information about Ravencroft's movements. No, full documentation wasn't yet available. The intelligence required corroboration before formal presentation to the council. Throughout the exchange, Magnus observed the elders' reactions, assessing their potential as witnesses for the Runanga ritual. Elder Mary showed genuine concern about territorial security rather than political positioning. Elder Corvin asked practical questions about defensive preparations. Elder Huron, however, framed every inquiry in relation to Ironwood's relationship with Ravencroft territories, clearly Thorne's closest ally among the 3. By the meeting's end, Magnus had identified Mary as a potential ritual witness, dismissed Huron as too politically aligned with Thorne, and marked Corvin as requiring further assessment. He would need at least 3 witnesses beyond himself and Garrick, council members with sufficient authority to sway the full assembly when the time came to present Alexandra openly. From the council chambers, Magnus proceeded directly to the healing wing, where Eleanor Frost maintained her practice. The healer's domain was a stark contrast to the military precision of the rest of the fortress. Warm, fragrant with herbs, softly lit by enchanted crystals that mimicked natural sunlight. Eleanor looked up from grinding herbs as he entered, her experienced hands never pausing in their work. "Commander, an unexpected visit. Are you injured, or is this about our mutual guest?" Magnus closed the door before responding. "It's about the Runanga ritual." Eleanor's hands stilled. She set aside her mortar and pestle, wiping her fingers on a cloth as she studied him with new intensity. "Garrick told you of my other role, then. He said you could serve as spiritual guide for the ritual, that your family has maintained the old traditions." A slight nod acknowledged this. "For generations, my grandmother guided the last Runanga performed in these territories. Nearly 60 years ago." She gestured to a private consultation area screened from the main healing space. "This conversation requires privacy." Once they were seated in the secluded alcove, Eleanor activated a privacy ward similar to those Magnus had seen Alexandra and Garrick use. The prevalence of such protections among those connected to restoration efforts spoke volumes about the caution they had learned to exercise. "You know who she really is," Eleanor stated rather than asked. "Yes, and you're planning to validate her identity through the Runanga." "If you're willing to serve as guide," Magnus confirmed. "Alexandra has consented to undergo the ritual. Garrick is preparing the sacred space. We need only your expertise to complete the preparations." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her weathered face revealing the weight of the decision before her. At 45, she had served as Ironwood's head healer for over a decade, respected across all factions for her skill and impartiality. Openly participating in the Runanga ritual would irreversibly align her with restoration efforts in the eyes of many. "The ritual is dangerous," she said finally, "not just politically but physically and spiritually. It opens participants to the ancestral realm, where deception is impossible but vulnerability is absolute. If Ravencroft has hunters with spiritual tracking abilities, and rumor suggests he does, they might detect the energy signature of royal blood exposed during the trance state." "We'll take precautions," Magnus assured her. "Limited witnesses, enhanced security perimeters, magical wards against detection." Eleanor shook her head slightly. "You misunderstand, Commander. I'm not refusing. I'm warning you of the risks. The Runanga isn't just a truth-telling ceremony. It's a doorway between worlds, between times. Those who enter the ancestral realm return changed, carrying knowledge and burdens they didn't possess before." "Changed how?" "It varies. Some gain insight into their own nature or purpose. Others receive visions of possible futures. A few develop heightened sensitivities to energies or intentions." Her eyes held his steadily. "For one with royal blood, the effects are amplified. The ancestral spirits will recognize Alexandra as their descendant. They may bestow gifts or demands." This was more complex than Garrick had indicated. Magnus had understood the ritual would validate Alexandra's identity, but these additional dimensions, potential spiritual transformations, obligations imposed by ancestral spirits, added layers of uncertainty to an already risky endeavor. "And the witnesses," he asked, "what effects might they experience?" "Less dramatic, but still significant. They'll perceive the truth of Alexandra's lineage and intentions with absolute clarity. No deception, no misinterpretation, but that clarity extends to themselves as well. They'll be forced to confront their own motivations, prejudices, hidden agendas." A grim smile touched Eleanor's lips. "It makes for interesting dynamics afterward. People rarely enjoy having their inner selves exposed, even to themselves." The implications were both concerning and potentially advantageous. Council members witnessing the ritual would be unable to deny Alexandra's legitimacy, but they would also be confronted with their own reactions to that truth, including any selfish political calculations or prejudices against restoration. "When can you be ready?" Magnus asked. 3 days. I'll need specific herbs from the deep forest, ceremonial implements from my family's collection. Time to prepare myself spiritually." Eleanor's expression grew more serious. "And I'll need your absolute assurance that security will be impenetrable. The ritual leaves participants defenseless during the trance state. If Thorne's people were to interrupt, or worse, if Ravencroft hunters somehow penetrated our defenses, I'll personally oversee security arrangements," Magnus promised. "Only those directly involved in the ritual will know its timing or location. Guards will be selected from my most trusted units, positioned to create multiple defensive perimeters." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, as though assessing more than his tactical planning. "You've changed since she arrived," she observed. "There's a new purpose in you, something beyond military duty or political calculation." Magnus didn't respond directly to the observation. "Will you serve as guide?" "Yes." Eleanor's decision seemed to settle something within her, a commitment that had perhaps been years in the making. Not just because Garrick asked, or because of what Alexandra represents politically. The land is suffering, Magnus. You've seen it in your patrols, the withering forests, the dwindling game, the increasing aggression of normally balanced creatures. As a healer, I feel these imbalances more acutely than most. If Alexandra's bloodline connection can begin to restore what was broken during the purge, my conscience allows no other choice. It was a perspective Magnus had heard repeatedly since Alexandra's arrival. First from the royal heir herself, then from Garrick, now from Eleanor. This belief that the territories were suffering not just from political fragmentation, but from a fundamental spiritual imbalance connected to the severed royal bloodline. As a military commander, Magnus had always focused on tangible threats and strategic advantages. But he couldn't dismiss the consistent testimony from those attuned to different aspects of their world. 3 days then, he confirmed, rising. I'll coordinate with Garrick on location and witness selection. Eleanor nodded. Send word through Captain Wolf when arrangements are finalized. And Magnus? Her voice softened slightly. Prepare yourself as well. The Runanga will reveal truths about all participants, including you. Consider carefully what you're ready to confront about your own path. The warning followed him as he departed the healing wing, adding yet another layer of complexity to an already precarious situation. The ritual would expose not just Alexandra's identity and intentions, but Magnus's own evolving loyalties, his doubts about established history, his growing conviction that protecting her served Ironwood's interests, even as it contradicted his formal duties. He would need to select witnesses who might understand such complexities. Council members capable of seeing beyond immediate political calculations to the longer-term implications for their territory's survival. Elder Mary remained his first choice, with her practical concern for territorial security. Elder Corvin required further assessment. Beyond them, a commotion near the fortress entrance interrupted his thoughts. Guards were admitting a patrol returning from the outer territories, their expressions grim as they supported wounded comrades. Magnus changed direction immediately, striding toward the disruption with the focused urgency of a commander receiving field reports. Captain Wolf met him halfway, his normally composed features tense with controlled anger. Sir, Northern Patrol encountered hunters in Ravine Pass. 4 wounded, 1 critical. Ravencroft hunters? In our territory? The implications were severe, a direct violation of territorial sovereignty, an act that bordered on declaration of war. Yes, sir, a 5-man team, heavily armed with silver weapons. They claimed to be pursuing fugitives with permission from neighboring territories. We've granted no such permission, Magnus stated flatly. Were they detained? A flash of regret crossed Wolf's features. They retreated when our patrol challenged them. Lieutenant Reed ordered pursuit, but given the wounded, he made the right call. Tending the wounded takes priority. Magnus watched as the injured were transferred to medical personnel, increased patrols along all border regions, full combat readiness, authorization to engage any unauthorized personnel penetrating our territory. Yes, sir. Wolf hesitated. Commander, one of the wounded reported something unusual. The hunters were carrying tracking implements, magical devices designed to detect specific energy signatures. They seemed to be searching for something particular, or someone. The realization struck Magnus with chilling clarity. Ravencroft's hunters were already inside Ironwood territory, using magical means to search for Alexandra. The timeline had compressed even further than he'd anticipated. Double the guards on our guest, he ordered. No one enters without my direct authorization. And Wolf, he added, lowering his voice, prepare contingency plans for rapid relocation if necessary. Full security protocols, need-to-know basis only. Wolf nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation without requiring explicit details. It was why Magnus valued him as second in command, the captain's ability to execute sensitive orders without unnecessary questions, his loyalty to Ironwood's security above political factions. What about the council, sir? Wolf asked. They'll need to be informed of this territorial violation. I'll handle the council, Magnus assured him. Focus on security preparations and patrol enhancements. As Wolf departed to implement the orders, Magnus considered his next moves with the calculated precision of a military strategist. The incursion changed everything. Ravencroft hunters operating within Ironwood territory represented both immediate danger to Alexandra and political opportunity with the Council. Even Thorne's faction couldn't ignore such a flagrant violation of sovereignty. He needed to convene an emergency council session immediately, using the incursion to justify enhanced security measures throughout Ironwood territory. Those measures would, coincidentally, provide cover for the Runanga preparations, while forcing Thorne into the awkward position of either supporting defensive actions against Ravencroft or appearing to prioritize political maneuvering over territorial security. Simultaneously, preparations for the ritual needed to accelerate. If Ravencroft's hunters were already searching Ironwood territory with magical tracking devices, they might detect Alexandra's presence regardless of the physical security surrounding her. The Runanga offered the fastest path to legitimacy, and legitimacy would transform her from fugitive to potential ally in the eyes of many council members. Time, already precious, had become critical. The 14 days Magnus had secured from the council were now largely irrelevant. Events were accelerating toward confrontation, whether they were prepared or not. As he strode toward the council chambers to call the emergency session, Magnus found himself contemplating Eleanor's warning about the Runanga's revelatory nature. The ritual would force him to confront truths about himself, about the path he was choosing, and its implications for his duty, his honor, his future. But perhaps such confrontation was overdue. The comfortable certainties of his previous life, his unquestioning loyalty to established authority, his acceptance of historical narratives, his clear understanding of duty, had been unraveling since the moment Alexandra revealed her royal mark. Sometimes, he reflected grimly, truth was the most dangerous weapon of all, more dangerous than silver blades or magical tracking devices, more dangerous than political machinations or territorial violations. Truth cut through carefully constructed defenses, exposed vulnerabilities, demanded response. In 3 days, the Runanga ritual would unleash that weapon upon them all. The only question was whether they would survive its revelations with the strength to face what came after. Magnus reached the council chambers and paused briefly, gathering his thoughts before entering. Beyond the ornate wooden doors, Ironwood's elders awaited, some allies, some adversaries, most somewhere in between. They would need to be managed carefully, guided toward the conclusions that best served their territory's security without revealing the full complexity of the situation surrounding Alexandra. Once, such political maneuvering would have felt foreign to Magnus's straightforward military mindset. Now it seemed merely another battlefield, with different weapons but the same fundamental objective: protect what matters, neutralize threats, secure advantageous positions for the conflicts to come. He pushed open the doors and strode into the chamber, ready to fight this latest battle with whatever weapons circumstances required, including, when necessary, the dangerous blade of truth. The sacred chamber lay deep beneath Ironwood's fortress, older than the structure above it, carved from living rock in an age when the boundaries between worlds were thinner. Magnus stood at the entrance, watching as Eleanor Frost made final preparations for the Runanga ritual. The healer moved with practiced precision, placing ceremonial objects at specific points around a central stone dais: a wolf's skull facing north, a silver mirror east, a bowl of clear spring water south, and a burning brazier of fragrant herbs west. 3 days had passed since the incursion of Ravencroft's hunters. 3 days of heightened patrols, political maneuvering and council sessions, and secret preparations for the ritual that might change everything. The emergency council meeting had gone as Magnus hoped. Even Thorne couldn't deny the seriousness of armed hunters violating Ironwood territory. Enhanced security measures had been unanimously approved, providing cover for the increased activity around Alexandra's quarters and the sacred chamber. "Is it ready?" Magnus asked as Eleanor completed a circle of crushed herbs around the dais. "Almost." She straightened, her expression solemn. "The physical preparations are complete, but the spiritual alignment requires Alexandra's presence. The ritual must be calibrated to her specific bloodline energy." Magnus nodded. "The witnesses are assembled in the antechamber. 3 council members, as we discussed: Elders Mary, Corvin, and Tolan. All three had been carefully selected for their combination of political influence and potential receptiveness to Alexandra's claim. Mary for her pragmatic concern with territorial security, Corvin for his deep historical knowledge and respect for ancient traditions, Tolan for his reputation as the council's most balanced mediator in factional disputes. Garrick would be present as well, both as a witness and as additional protection should anything go wrong. And Thorne? Eleanor asked, a hint of tension in her voice. Occupied with the border inspection in the Western Territories. Captain Wolfe arranged a concerning report that required the Thonglin's personal attention. Magnus allowed himself a small smile. He'll be furious when he discovers the Runanga was conducted without his presence, but by then it will be too late to challenge the validity of the witness's testimony. Eleanor nodded, satisfied with the security arrangements. And the outer perimeter? 3 layers of guards, all personally selected. No one approaches without my knowledge. Magnus had implemented the defensive structure with military precision, positioning his most trusted soldiers to create concentric rings of protection around the sacred chamber. How long will the ritual last? Impossible to predict precisely, Eleanor replied, adjusting the angle of the ceremonial mirror. The ancestral spirits move according to their own time, typically between 1 and 3 hours in our realm, though participants often experience it as much longer. And the risks you mentioned? The possibility of Ravencroft's hunters detecting the ritual's energy? Eleanor's expression grew grave. We've implemented every protective ward in my family's knowledge. Ancient symbols carved into the chamber walls, specialized herbs burning in the brazier. Protective chants I'll maintain throughout. But the royal bloodline carries a distinct energy signature. When fully awakened during the trance state, she hesitated. If Ravencroft has spiritual trackers of sufficient power, they might detect something, despite our precautions. It was a calculated risk, one they had discussed extensively. The immediate danger from hunters already in Ironwood territory had to be balanced against the potential benefit of validating Alexandra's identity before influential council members. If the ritual succeeded, Alexandra would gain legitimate protection from Ironwood's full military might, not just Magnus's personal intervention. We proceed as planned, Magnus decided. I'll bring Alexandra now. He found her in a small meditation room adjacent to the main chamber, preparing herself for the ordeal ahead. She wore a simple white robe provided by Eleanor, her dark hair loose around her shoulders rather than in its usual practical braid. The formal simplicity heightened her natural regal bearing, making it difficult to remember the Omega refugee who had arrived at their borders less than a week ago. Alexandra opened her silver eyes as he entered, the calm in her gaze belying the momentous nature of what she was about to undertake. Is it time? Magnus nodded. The witnesses are ready. Eleanor has completed the physical preparations. And you? She asked, studying his face with that unsettling perceptiveness. Are you prepared for what the ritual may reveal? The question echoed Eleanor's warning from days earlier. The Runanga would expose truths about all participants, not just Alexandra. Magnus had spent hours considering what that might mean for him, what hidden motivations or unacknowledged doubts might be revealed before the assembled witnesses. I've served Ironwood for 20 years, he replied simply. My loyalty to its people, if not always its politics, will withstand scrutiny. Alexandra rose with fluid grace. There's a difference between loyalty and blind obedience, Commander. The Runanga tends to illuminate such distinctions with uncomfortable clarity. A small smile touched her lips. But then I suspect you've been reconsidering many such distinctions since we met. It was true, though Magnus didn't acknowledge it aloud. His understanding of duty, of history, of the proper order of their world had been shifting daily since discovering the royal mark on Alexandra's skin. The Runanga would merely formalize a transformation already underway within him. The witnesses await us, he said instead, gesturing toward the door. They walked in silence through the torchlit corridor connecting the preparation room to the main ritual chamber. Guards posted at intervals snapped to attention as they passed, their expressions carefully neutral, despite the extraordinary circumstances. Magnus had told them only that a specialized security assessment was being conducted, classified information that required absolute discretion. The chamber itself seemed transformed since Magnus had left it minutes earlier. The previously steady torches now flickered with an unnatural rhythm, casting shifting shadows across the ancient stone walls. The air felt thicker, charged with expectancy, as though the space itself recognized what was about to occur. Eleanor stood beside the central dais, now draped in a cloth embroidered with symbols so old even Magnus couldn't identify them. Garrick and the three council members formed a semicircle at a respectful distance, their faces solemn in the wavering light. "The ritual participant approaches," Eleanor announced formally, her voice taking on a deeper resonance than her usual healing room tone. "Let all witnesses open their hearts and minds to the truth that will be revealed, setting aside prejudice and preconception." Alexandra moved forward with measured steps, her white robe luminous in the torchlight. She took her position on the dais, kneeling at its center with hands rested palm up on her thighs, the traditional posture of one submitting to ancestral judgment. "Who stands as guardian of the participant's physical form during the spiritual journey?" Eleanor asked, following the ancient protocol. "I do." Magnus stepped forward, positioning himself at the edge of the dais. The guardian's role was both ceremonial and practical, responsible for protecting the participant's vulnerable body during the trance state, and if necessary, administering the herbs that would forcibly end the trance should danger arise. Eleanor nodded in acknowledgement, then turned to the assembled witnesses. "Elders of Ironwood, you have been called to observe the Runanga ritual, the sacred truth-seeking of our ancestors. You will witness with both eyes and spirit. You will judge with both mind and heart. You will speak the truth of what is revealed, without addition or omission, when you return to your council chambers." Each elder nodded solemnly, understanding the binding nature of the oath. To falsify testimony after witnessing the Runanga was considered one of the gravest spiritual violations in werewolf tradition, an offense against not just the living community, but the ancestral spirits themselves. "Then let us begin." Eleanor moved to the brazier, adding a handful of dried herbs that filled the chamber with sweet-smelling smoke. "Ancestors of blood and bone, guardians of truth and memory, we call to you across the veil between worlds. Open the path for this seeker, that she may stand before you in judgment and revelation." The ritual words, spoken in the ancient language of their kind, seemed to resonate with the very stones of the chamber. Magnus felt the vibrations through the soles of his boots, a subtle trembling that spoke of power older than ironwood itself. Eleanor continued the invocation, moving sunwise around the dais while trailing smoke from a bundle of smoldering herbs. "By water that flows through all life, by fire that transforms and purifies, by earth that sustains and anchors, by air that connects all breath, we open the way between worlds." Alexandra remained motionless at the center, eyes closed, breathing measured. Only Magnus, standing closest, could see the subtle tension in her shoulders, the concentration evident in her composed features. For all her apparent calm, she was navigating treacherous spiritual territory, preparing to expose her innermost self to forces that had not been awakened in generations. "The seeker presents herself for judgment," Eleanor intoned, completing her circle and returning to stand before Alexandra. "She offers her true name and lineage to the ancestors." Alexandra's eyes opened, silver irises seeming to catch and amplify the torchlight. "I am Alexandra Drakefire, daughter of King Edric Drakefire and Queen Lyria of the Silvercrest bloodline, rightful heir to the Northern Throne and the sacred covenant between royal blood and territorial balance." The declaration hung in the air for a heartbeat, powerful in its simplicity. Then Eleanor reached forward, pressing her fingers to Alexandra's forehead in the traditional gesture that would facilitate the transition to trance state. "Journey now to the ancestral realm," she commanded softly. "Stand before those who came before, those who know all truths, those who guard the sacred balance. Return with their judgment, their wisdom, their blessing, or their condemnation." Alexandra's eyes drifted closed again, her breathing slowing visibly as the trance began to take hold. Magnus watched intently, noting every subtle change in her demeanor, the gradual relaxation of tension, the slight parting of her lips, the almost imperceptible glow that seemed to emanate from beneath her skin. The ritual had begun in earnest. Now they could only wait, bearing witness as Alexandra's spirit journeyed to realms beyond their perception, while her physical body remained vulnerable before them. Eleanor maintained a continuous low chant, weaving protective energies around the chamber. The three council members watched in respectful silence, expressions ranging from Elder Mary's intense concentration to Elder Tolan's barely concealed awe. Garrick's weathered face revealed nothing, but his eyes never left Alexandra's form, as though he could somehow perceive the spiritual journey taking place beyond physical sight. Minutes stretched into an hour with little outward change. Occasionally, Alexandra's breathing would alter rhythm, or her fingers would twitch slightly, but she remained deep in trance, unreachable by ordinary means. Then subtly at first, the atmosphere in the chamber began to shift. The torches flared brighter without apparent cause. The air grew noticeably warmer, carrying scents of summer forests and wild meadows, rather than the enclosed stone of the underground chamber. "It begins," Eleanor murmured, briefly interrupting her protective chant. The ancestral spirits recognize her claim. As if in response to her words, a soft golden glow manifested around Alexandra's kneeling form, faint at first, then steadily strengthening until her entire body was outlined in luminous energy. The light pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, creating patterns that flowed across her skin like liquid gold. "The royal mark," Garrick breathed, barely audible. Indeed, the birthmark on Alexandra's shoulders had become visible, even through her robe, the three-headed phoenix glowing with an intensity that made the white fabric nearly transparent. The ancestral spirits were confirming her bloodline in the most dramatic way possible, making the royal mark luminous for all witnesses to observe. Elder Corvin gasped softly, his historical knowledge providing immediate context for what they were witnessing. Just as the ancient texts described, the awakening of royal blood during spiritual communion. Elder Mary's practical skepticism seemed to waver as she watched the undeniable manifestation before them. "This cannot be falsified, not even by powerful magic." "The ancestral realm permits no deception," Eleanor confirmed without breaking the rhythm of her protective chant. "What you witness is absolute truth, Elder Mary. The royal bloodline lives in her." The golden light continued to strengthen, now extending beyond Alexandra's immediate form to create patterns across the stone floor, intricate spirals and ancient symbols appearing as though written in light. Magnus recognized some from historical texts, the emblems of royal authority that had been systematically destroyed during the Great Purge. "The Covenant," Elder Tolan murmured, his diplomatic reserve cracking in the face of such extraordinary evidence. "The sacred bond between royal blood and territorial balance. It's manifesting physically." Magnus had positioned himself to maintain clear sight of both Alexandra and the chamber entrance, military instincts never fully subsiding despite the spiritual nature of the proceedings. This vigilance allowed him to notice when the light patterns on the floor began flowing toward the northern wall, not randomly but with deliberate purpose, as though seeking something beyond the chamber itself. Eleanor noticed as well, her chanting faltering momentarily. "The energy reaches outward," she said, concern evident in her voice. "The royal bloodline calls to the land, and the land responds. This is stronger than anticipated." The implications were immediately clear to Magnus. The ritual was generating magical energies far more powerful than their protective measures had been designed to contain. If Ravencroft's spiritual trackers were within range, they would detect the distinctive signature of awakened royal blood despite all precautions. "How much longer?" he asked quietly, moving closer to Eleanor. "Impossible to say," she replied, her concentration divided between maintaining protective chants and monitoring Alexandra's trance state. "The ancestral communion proceeds according to its own timeline. Forcing it to end prematurely could be dangerous for her." Magnus weighed the options with military precision. The ritual needed to complete properly for the council witnesses to receive the full validation of Alexandra's claim. Yet every minute it continued increased the risk of detection by Ravencroft's hunters. Before he could decide on a course of action, Alexandra's body tensed suddenly, her back arching as though in response to an invisible touch. Her lips parted, and she spoke in a voice that seemed layered with others, deeper, more resonant than her normal tone. "The bloodline is confirmed, the covenant renewed, the balance begins its restoration." The formal declaration, spoken in the ancient ceremonial language, caused the golden light to pulse dramatically, momentarily filling the entire chamber with blinding brilliance. When it receded seconds later, patterns had formed on the walls themselves, intricate murals depicting scenes from the royal dynasty's history, glowing as though freshly painted in liquid light. "By the ancient moon," Elder Corvin breathed, turning slowly to take in the supernatural display surrounding them. "It's the complete lineage, the unbroken chain of succession from the first queen to Alexandra herself." Indeed, the light murals showed a progression of rulers, each bearing the distinctive phoenix mark, each connected to their successor by threads of golden energy. The final image, directly above Alexandra's kneeling form, showed her own face, rendered with uncanny accuracy, crowned in spectral light. The witnesses stared in undisguised awe. Even Garrick, who had dedicated his life to restoration efforts, seemed overwhelmed by the tangible manifestation of the beliefs he had held for decades. The ritual nears completion, Eleanor announced, her voice strained from maintaining protective energies against the overwhelming force of the ancestral manifestation. The spirits have rendered their judgment. As if confirming her assessment, the golden light began to withdraw from the walls and floor, condensing once more around Alexandra's form. Her breathing, which had remained slow and measured throughout the trance, quickened noticeably. Her fingers flexed, then curled into loose fists. She returns to herself, Eleanor explained, moving to stand before the dais. The journey between worlds concludes. Magnus maintained his position as guardian, hyper-alert to both Alexandra's condition and any potential threats to the chamber's security. The display of power they had witnessed would almost certainly have been detectable beyond their protective wards. If Ravencroft's hunters were within Ironwood territory, they would be converging on their location even now. Alexandra's eyes opened suddenly, the silver of her irises now ringed with gold, a physical transformation that provoked another round of startled murmurs from the witnesses. She blinked once, twice, adjusting to physical perception after the spiritual journey. Then her gaze found Magnus, carrying a weight of new knowledge and unspoken communication. "Welcome back," Eleanor said formally, helping Alexandra to stand. "The ancestors have spoken through you. The witnesses have observed. Do you recall your journey?" Alexandra nodded, her movements fluid despite having knelt motionless for nearly 2 hours. "I remember everything. The communion with ancestors, the validation of bloodline, the renewal of covenant." She turned to face the assembled witnesses. "I have been recognized by those who came before. The royal lineage continues unbroken, despite the Ravencroft's attempts to extinguish it." The three council members exchanged glances, the weight of what they had witnessed settling upon them. They had come expecting a security assessment ritual. They had found themselves participants in what amounted to a supernatural coronation. "The ritual is complete," Eleanor announced, extinguishing the ceremonial brazier with a handful of salt. "Let all who witness speak truth when they return to the world above. Let all who participated carry the wisdom granted by the ancestors." Tradition dictated a period of silent reflection following the Runanga, allowing participants to integrate the experience before discussing it openly. But circumstances allowed no such luxury. As soon as Eleanor completed the formal closing of the ritual, Magnus moved to her side. "We need to move quickly," he said in a low voice. "That display of power would have been detectable for miles. If Ravencroft's hunters are anywhere in our territory, they'll be coming," she agreed grimly. The protective wards were overwhelmed by the strength of the ancestral response. "I've never seen such powerful manifestations, even in my grandmother's accounts of previous rituals." Magnus turned to address the witnesses, keeping his tone measured despite the urgency. "Elders, what you have witnessed confirms beyond doubt that Alexandra Drakefire is the rightful heir to the Northern Throne. As Thong Soai of Ironwood, I must now secure her safety against imminent threat. Ravencroft hunters have already violated our territory once. After this ritual, they will redouble their efforts to find her." Elder Mary was the first to recover her political bearing. "This changes everything, Commander. The Council must convene immediately to reconsider Ironwood's position regarding restoration. And regarding Ravencroft's territorial violations," Elder Corvin added, the historian clearly processing the implications for current politics. "If the Grand Duke is actively hunting the rightful heir, using methods that violate sovereignty agreements, it constitutes an act of war against all territories." "One crisis at a time," Magnus said firmly. "First, we must secure Alexandra and manage the immediate security threat. Then the Council can debate political ramifications." He turned to Garrick. "Escort the elders to the Council chambers through the secure route we prepared. I'll join you after ensuring Alexandra's safety." Garrick nodded, understanding the strategic necessity of separating Alexandra from the Council members until proper security measures were established. "This way, honored elders, we've prepared a discreet path to avoid unwanted attention." As they departed, Magnus turned to Alexandra and Eleanor. "We have minutes at most before Ravencroft's hunters detect the ritual site. We need to move you to a more defensible location." Alexandra's expression was calm despite the danger, her bearing subtly altered since completing the ritual. The regal confidence had always been there, but now it seemed integrated with something deeper, a spiritual authority that transcended political claim. "The hunters won't be the only ones who felt the ritual's power," she said. Every werewolf with sensitivity to primal energies will have sensed something, even without understanding exactly what occurred. The land itself responds to awakened royal blood. Magnus had no time to contemplate the metaphysical implications. Can you travel? The trance state sometimes leaves after effects. I'm stronger now than before the ritual, Alexandra assured him. The communion with ancestors has awakened aspects of the bloodline that were dormant. As if to demonstrate, she extended her hand, and the small flame Magnus had seen her produce days earlier now manifested as a dancing sphere of golden fire twice the size, perfectly controlled despite its intensity. My connection to primal energies has deepened considerably. Under ordinary circumstances, such a development would warrant extensive discussion and possibly concern. Currently, it represented a potential tactical advantage in the event of confrontation with hunters. Eleanor, return to the healing wing through the eastern passage, Magnus instructed. Your absence would be noticed if you remain hidden too long. Alexander and I will take the northern route to the secure location we prepared. The healer nodded, gathering her ceremonial implements with practiced efficiency. Be vigilant, both of you. The ritual has changed more than just Alexandra's spiritual connection. All participants have been touched by the ancestral energies, including you, Commander. Magnus hadn't noticed any changes in himself, but there was no time to investigate Eleanor's cryptic warning. Security concerns took precedence over spiritual after-effects. Once Eleanor had departed, Magnus led Alexandra through a narrow passage hidden behind a sliding stone panel, one of many secret routes built into the fortress during its construction centuries ago. These passages, known only to the Thong Soi and a few trusted officers, provided secure movement throughout the structure when standard corridors might be compromised. Where are we going? Alexandra asked as they navigated the dimly lit tunnel. A secure chamber in the northwest tower, Magnus replied, moving with the confident precision of one who had memorized every route. Defensible, with multiple escape options if necessary. Captain Wolf has positioned trusted guards at key points, operating under the impression that we're conducting a classified intelligence operation. The passage climbs steadily upward, transitioning from ancient stone to construction more consistent with the upper fortress. After several minutes and multiple directional changes designed to confuse anyone who might discover the secret paths, they reached a small antechamber with 3 possible exits. Magnus paused, listening intently. Years of battlefield experience had honed his senses to detect subtle warnings that logic alone might miss. Something felt wrong, not immediately threatening but requiring caution. Wait here, he instructed, moving to check the exit that would lead to their intended destination. The moment he reached the concealed door, his instincts flared in alarm. The faintest trace of an unfamiliar scent lingered near the mechanism. Someone had been here recently, someone not authorized to access the secret passages. Magnus returned to Alexandra, his expression grim. Change of plans. This route may be compromised. Her silver gold eyes widened slightly. Ravencroft's hunters? Inside the fortress? Unlikely this deep, Magnus assessed. More likely Thorne's people conducting unauthorized surveillance. Either way, we can't risk the planned route. He considered alternatives rapidly. We'll take the eastern passage instead, emerge near the armory, then proceed to the outer wall via standard corridors. Less secrecy, but more witnesses if anyone attempts to interfere. Alexandra nodded, trusting his tactical judgment. They backtracked to a junction, then took the rightmost passage, moving at a pace that balanced speed with stealth. The eastern route was longer but less complex, eventually opening into a small storage room adjacent to Ironwood's main armory. Magnus checked carefully before allowing Alexandra to emerge from the hidden entrance, confirming the room was empty and showing no signs of recent disturbance. From here we'll move openly, he explained, securing the hidden door behind them. You're still officially under Thong Shuai's privilege protection. No one can legally interfere with your movement when accompanied by me. Legally being the operative word, Alexandra noted with grim humor. Indeed. Magnus straightened his uniform jacket, resuming the formal bearing expected of Ironwood's commander. Stay close, maintain the demeanor of a protected intelligence asset, and let me handle any challenges. They emerged into this main corridor, where activity continued as normal. Soldiers moving between duties, messengers carrying communications, the routine operations of a military fortress. Several personnel saluted as Magnus passed, their eyes flickering curiously to Alexandra before discipline reasserted itself. They had progressed halfway to the outer ward when Captain Wolf intercepted them, his expression conveying urgency without alarm, the practiced composure of an officer delivering sensitive information in public spaces. "Commander," he greeted with a formal salute, "a situation requires your attention at the North Gate. Visitors from the Eastern Territories requesting immediate audience." Magnus understood the coded message immediately. Ravencroft representatives. "Not exactly, sir." Wolf's careful phrasing suggested complexity beyond simple diplomatic arrival. "Their credentials appear authentic, but their timing is noteworthy." "I see." Magnus assessed options quickly. "Escort our guests to the location we discussed earlier. I'll address the visitors personally." Wolf nodded, positioning himself at Alexandra's side with professional courtesy. "This way, please." "Wait." Alexandra's voice was low but commanding. "These visitors, describe them." Wolf glanced at Magnus, receiving a subtle nod of permission before answering. "5 individuals, well-armed but displaying peaceful intent. Their leader is female, silver-haired, perhaps 50 years of age. They carry the banner of the Shadowrunners." Alexander's expression transformed from cautious to urgently hopeful. "Liana," she breathed. "It must be Liana Shadowcrest." "You know these people?" Magnus asked sharply. "Loyalists from the Eastern Territories. Liana was my mother's closest confidant before the Purge, one of the few who knew I survived." Alexander's eyes held his intently. "If she's here, it's because the Loyalist Network detected the Runanga ritual. They've come to offer protection and possibly allegiance." The arrival of Loyalist forces at this precise moment created both opportunity and complication. Additional protection for Alexander was valuable, but openly receiving known Restoration supporters would accelerate the political consequences Magnus had hoped to manage more gradually. "Change of plans," he decided. "Captain Wolf, secure our planned location, but do not take Alexandra there yet. Instead, escort her to my private strategy room. I'll meet with these visitors, assess their intentions, then determine next steps." Wolf acknowledged the new orders with professional efficiency, leading Alexander toward a different corridor, while Magnus proceeded to the North Gate. As he walked, his mind calculated ramifications, identified potential challenges, and formulated contingency plans. The automatic strategic analysis that had kept him alive through decades of conflict. The visitors waited in the formal reception chamber, an austere space designed for initial meetings with diplomatic envoys. As Wolf had reported, they numbered 5, 3 males and 2 females, all bearing the distinctive silvery gray eyes of the Shadowrunner bloodline. Their leader stood slightly ahead of the others, her silver hair elaborately braided in the Eastern tradition, her bearing simultaneously martial and diplomatic. "Thong Soi Blackthorn," she greeted, with formal respect. "I am Liana Shadowcrest, Blood Elder of the Eastern Ranges, Shield Sister to the late Queen Lyria Drakefire, and loyal servant to the rightful heir of the Northern Throne." Magnus assessed her carefully, noting the weapons visible at her sides and the likely concealed ones his experienced eye detected. These were warriors as well as diplomats, prepared for any eventuality. "Blood Elder Shadowcrest," he acknowledged. "Your arrival at Ironwood is precisely timed." A small smile touched her lips. "The land speaks to those who listen, Commander." Today, it spoke quite loudly. Her silvery eyes held his steadily. "The royal bloodline has awakened. The covenant begins its renewal. Those loyal to the old ways felt the call across all territories." So Alexander had been correct. The Runanga ritual had sent spiritual ripples far beyond Ironwood's boundaries, detectable by those attuned to such energies, which meant Ravencroft's spiritually sensitive hunters would indeed be converging on their location with deadly purpose. "Why come directly to Ironwood?" Magnus asked, maintaining the careful neutrality expected of his position despite the rapidly evolving situation. "Such open allegiance to Restoration places you at significant risk." "The time for shadows and whispers has passed, Commander." Liana's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "The heir has revealed herself. The ancestral spirits have confirmed her claim. Now all must choose, stand with legitimate authority or with those who murdered a dynasty to seize power." Her directness was both refreshing and politically dangerous. Magnus glanced at the guards posted discreetly around the chamber, assessing their reactions. Most maintained professional impassivity, but he noted subtle tells in some, a tightening of jaw muscles, a shift in stance, that indicated personal responses to Liana's bold declaration. Ironwood's position regarding succession disputes has been neutral for generations, Magnus replied carefully, aware that his words would be reported throughout the fortress within hours. We prioritize the security of our territory and people above external political conflicts. A commendable position, Liana acknowledged, but neutrality becomes complicity when one side systematically violates territorial sovereignty, hunts innocent citizens, and disrupts the natural balance of the land itself. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. We know Alexandra Drakefire is here. We know she completed the Runanga ritual less than an hour ago. And we know Ravencroft's hunters are converging on Ironwood from all directions, authorized to kill anyone who stands between them and the last royal heir. The information alignment confirmed Magnus's suspicion that the Shadowrunners possessed an intelligence network rivaling Ironwood's own. Lyanna Shadowcrest knew not only that Alexandra was within the fortress, but specific details about the ritual itself, knowledge that represented either remarkable spiritual sensitivity or more mundane infiltration of Ironwood's security. What exactly are you proposing, Blood Elder? Magnus asked directly. Alliance. Lyanna's answer was equally direct. The Shadowrunners offer our warriors, our resources, and our territory as sanctuary if needed. In return, we ask that Ironwood acknowledge Alexandra Drakefire's legitimate claim and grant her formal protection under territorial law. It was simultaneously a generous offer and a politically explosive demand. Accepting would effectively position Ironwood as the first major territory to officially support restoration, a declaration that would ripple throughout the fragmented lands, forcing other pacts and territories to declare their own positions. Such decisions require council approval, Magnus said, neither accepting nor rejecting the proposal. Ironwood's governance structure doesn't permit unilateral commitments of this magnitude, even from the Thong Soai. Lyanna studied him with the calculating assessment of a seasoned political operator. Yet the Thong Soai's recommendation carries significant weight, particularly in matters of territorial security. A knowing smile touched her lips. And I suspect recent events have provided compelling evidence that Alexandra's safety directly impacts that security. Before Magnus could respond, the chamber door opened to admit Captain Wolf, his expression conveying urgent information requiring immediate attention. Commander, he said formally, a situation has developed at the eastern perimeter. Multiple unknown forces approaching our border. Forward scouts report they bear Ravencroft insignia and appear combat ready. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Ravencroft's forces had likely been positioning for days, waiting for confirmation of Alexandra's location before launching a direct assault on Ironwood territory. Numbers? Magnus asked sharply. Initial reports suggest at least 30 warriors, sir, heavily armed with silver-based weapons. A significant force, though not large enough to overwhelm Ironwood's defenses in a traditional engagement. But this wouldn't be traditional. Ravencroft wasn't declaring open war against Ironwood, but pursuing a fugitive they would claim legal right to apprehend. Mobilize the border units, Magnus ordered. Full defensive posture, but no engagement without direct provocation. I want communication lines open to our forward positions. As Wolf departed to implement the orders, Magnus turned back to Lyanna, whose expression had grown grimly satisfied at the news. It seems Ravencroft has made your decision more urgent, Commander, she observed. His forces move against your territory while the Council debates political nuances. How will Ironwood respond? The question wasn't just for Magnus, but for the witnesses present. The guards whose reports would filter through the fortress, the aides whose observations would reach council members. In this moment, Magnus's response would set Ironwood's effective position regardless of formal declarations. Ironwood defends its sovereignty against all unauthorized incursions, he stated with calm authority. Anyone violating our borders without formal permission will be treated as hostile, regardless of their claimed justification. It was a deliberately measured response, asserting Ironwood's right to self-defense without explicitly addressing Alexandra's status or Ravencroft's claims. But Lyanna recognized the implicit decision behind the careful wording. The Shadowrunners stand ready to fight alongside Ironwood's defenders, she offered formally. Our warriors await your command, Thong Soai. The offer of military alliance complicated an already volatile situation. Accepting would effectively recognize the Shadowrunners as legitimate allies rather than restoration agitators, a significant political step. Refusing might alienate potential support when Ravencroft's forces were literally at their borders. Your warriors remain under your command, Blood Elder, Magnus replied diplomatically. but I welcome coordination between our forces to address common security concerns. This compromise, acknowledging potential cooperation without formal integration of command structures, seemed to satisfy Liana for the moment. She inclined her head in acknowledgement. Then perhaps I should speak with Alexandra directly, she suggested, to coordinate our respective protections. Magnus weighed the request carefully. Allowing Liana access to Alexandra before the council formally determined her status created political risks. Yet the Shadowrunners clearly possessed information and resources that could prove vital in the coming confrontation with Ravencroft's forces. I'll arrange a secure meeting, he decided. But first, I must assess our defensive posture given these developments. Liana accepted this with the patience of a leader accustomed to complex negotiations. We will await your arrangements, Commander. But be aware, Ravencroft's approach from the east may be a diversion. His elite hunters would use more subtle methods to infiltrate your territory, while conventional forces draw attention to the borders. The warning aligned with Magnus's own tactical assessment. Ravencroft was too experienced a strategist to believe a frontal assault would successfully extract Alexandra from Ironwood's fortress. The border force was likely meant to occupy Ironwood's military response, while specialized hunters attempted infiltration through less guarded approaches. Captain Reeves, Magnus addressed the senior guard present, escort Blood Elder Shadowcrest and her companions to the diplomatic quarters. Ensure appropriate security and accommodations. He turned back to Liana. I'll send word once our immediate security concerns are addressed. With formal courtesies exchanged, Magnus departed for the command center, his mind processing multiple strategic layers simultaneously. Ravencroft's forces at the border, Shadowrunners offering alliance, council members who had witnessed the Runanga now presumably discussing its implications in emergency session, and Alexandra, her claims supernaturally validated but her safety still precarious, waiting for his next decision. The command center hummed with controlled urgency when Magnus arrived. Officers moved purposefully between stations, receiving reports from border units and issuing deployment orders for defensive positions. Captain Wolf stood at the central table, studying a detailed map of Ironwood territory with markers indicating known enemy positions. Status report, Magnus demanded, assuming his natural place at the head of the command table. Ravencroft's forces maintain position just beyond our eastern border, Wolf reported crisply. They've established what appears to be a forward operating base approximately half a mile from our boundary markers. No aggressive movements yet, but their formation suggests preparation for potential engagement. And our defenses? 4 units deployed along the eastern perimeter, 2 in reserve positions. Archers on elevated platforms with clear sight lines to approach routes. Magical detection wards activated along all borders to alert us to crossing attempts. Magnus studied the tactical display, identifying potential vulnerabilities. Increased patrols along the northern ravine. It's difficult terrain, but experienced infiltrators could use it to bypass our main defensive line. Already implemented, Sir, Wolf confirmed, and I've positioned our most spiritually sensitive scouts at key points throughout the territory. If Ravencroft's hunters attempt magical concealment, we should detect the energy signatures. It was as comprehensive a defensive strategy as circumstances permitted, though Magnus harbored no illusions about its infallibility. If Ravencroft was determined enough, and all evidence suggested he was, some of his hunters would eventually penetrate Ironwood's defenses, regardless of precautions. What of the council? Magnus asked, addressing the political dimension of their crisis. In emergency sessions since the witnesses returned from the ritual, Wolf reported, Garrick sent word that debate is vigorous. Thorn returned from his border inspection and is apparently quite vocal about being excluded from the Runanga. That was expected. Thorn would perceive the ritual conducted in his absence as a deliberate political maneuver, which, of course, it had been. His reaction would be proportionately aggressive, especially once he learned of the Shadowrunners' arrival and Ravencroft's forces at the border. And Alexandra? Secure in your strategy room as ordered, sir. 2 of our most trusted guards at the door, no visitors permitted without your direct authorization. Magnus nodded approval. Maintain current defensive posture. I need to brief Alexandra on developments, then address the council. Send immediate word if Ravencroft's forces make any significant movements. The short journey to his private strategy room gave Magnus precious minutes to organize his thoughts. Events were accelerating beyond the careful timeline he had envisioned after the Runanga. The ritual itself had proceeded as planned, with council witnesses experiencing irrefutable proof of Alexandra's royal lineage. But the immediate aftermath, loyalist allies arriving openly at their gates, Ravencroft's forces massing at their borders, had compressed what should have been days of careful political maneuvering into hours of crisis management. Alexandra looked up from studying a territorial map when Magnus entered the strategy room. The ritual had left visible changes beyond the golden ring now circling her silver irises. She carried herself with heightened confidence, a more seamless integration of royal authority and practical capability. Even her physical movements seemed more graceful, as though ancestral communion had refined her connection to her own body. Ravencroft's forces have reached our borders, she said without preamble, and Lyanna Shadowcrest brings Shadowrunner warriors offering alliance. Magnus raised an eyebrow, unsurprised that she had already gleaned the essential developments despite her physical isolation. Your information network remains impressive. A small smile touched her lips. Not network. The ritual enhanced my connection to the territorial energies. I can sense significant movements within Ironwood's boundaries, particularly those made with strong intent. This development, a form of supernatural awareness extending throughout the territory, represented both strategic advantage and potential complication. Such abilities were consistent with historical accounts of royal bloodline powers, but their emergence now accelerated the timeline for addressing Alexandra's status among Ironwood's leadership. The council debates as we speak, Magnus informed her, moving to the map she had been studying. The witnesses from the ritual are presumably sharing what they observed. Thorn has returned and discovered his exclusion from the proceedings. And how will you address them? Alexandra asked, watching him carefully. The ritual confirmed my identity beyond reasonable doubt. The witnesses cannot deny what they experienced. But acknowledgement of my claim carries immediate political consequences, as evidenced by both Lyanna's arrival and Ravencroft's response. It was the central question Magnus had been weighing since the ritual concluded. His personal conviction regarding Alexandra's legitimacy was now settled. The Renanga had provided spiritual confirmation that aligned with his own growing certainty. But his responsibility as Thong Soi required balancing that truth against Ironwood's security interests. I will present the facts as witnessed during the ritual, he said finally. The supernatural validation of your bloodline is not a matter of political opinion, but established truth. From that foundation, I will advocate for Ironwood to formally acknowledge your legitimate claim to the Northern Throne. Alexandra's expression revealed momentary surprise at his directness, quickly replaced by solemn appreciation. That position places you in direct opposition to Ravencroft, and likely to Thorn and his faction within your council. It does. Magnus met her gaze steadily. But continuing to navigate a false neutrality serves neither truth nor Ironwood's long-term interests. Ravencroft's forces at our border demonstrate the futility of avoiding this confrontation. And the Shadowrunners? Will you accept their offered alliance? Conditionally, Magnus replied. Their warriors provide valuable reinforcement against Ravencroft's immediate threat. But formal political alliance requires council approval through established protocols. Alexandra nodded, understanding the careful balance he was attempting to maintain, moving Ironwood towards supporting her claim while preserving constitutional governance structures. Lyanna will want to see me, she noted. She was my mother's closest friend, one of the few who knew I survived the palace massacre. Her loyalty to the bloodline transcends ordinary politics. I'll arrange a meeting once I've addressed the council, Magnus promised. But first, we need to establish your official status within Ironwood to provide legal framework for such discussions. A soft chime from the communication crystal interrupted their conversation. Magnus activated the device, receiving Captain Wolf's voice with characteristic clarity despite the distance. Commander, the council requests your immediate presence. They've moved from debate to formal deliberation regarding our response to current developments. Acknowledged en route. Magnus deactivated the crystal and turned back to Alexandra. It appears the moment of decision has arrived sooner than anticipated. The ritual changed more than just me, she observed. It altered the spiritual energy throughout Ironwood territory. The council members would have felt it, even those who weren't present as witnesses. The land itself demands acknowledgement of truth after so many years of imbalance. Whether her assessment was metaphysical insight or political calculation, the practical effect remained the same. Ironwood faced a defining moment, one that would determine not just Alexandra's fate, but the territory's position in the inevitable conflict spreading across the fragmented lands. Remain here, Magnus instructed. I'll send Wolf with news once the council reaches its decision. If circumstances require rapid movement, he'll escort you via secure routes we've prepared. Alexandra nodded, then surprised him by extending her hand in a formal gesture, typically exchanged between allied military commanders. Whatever comes, Magnus Blackthorn, you have fulfilled your duty with honor, to Ironwood, to truth, and to the covenant between rulers and territories. I will not forget it. Magnus clasped her offered forearm in the traditional warrior's grip. The duty continues. We face its greatest test in the hours ahead. The council chambers hummed with tense energy when Magnus arrived. All 12 elders were present, arranged in their formal semicircle, with Garrick occupying the central seat of authority. Thorn sat to his right, face rigid with barely contained fury. Whether at his exclusion from the Runanga or at the subsequent developments was unclear. Garrick acknowledged Magnus's arrival with a formal nod. Thong Soi Blackthorn, the council has received preliminary reports regarding multiple situations requiring immediate attention. We request your official assessment and recommendation for Ironwood's response. The carefully neutral phrasing indicated that Garrick was maintaining procedural formality despite what must have been hours of heated debate. It also provided Magnus the opportunity to frame the situation according to his strategic assessment rather than responding to potentially loaded questions. Honored Council, Magnus began, taking his position at the center of the chamber. Ironwood currently faces 3 interconnected developments requiring coordinated response. First, the Renanga ritual conducted earlier today provided supernatural confirmation of Alexandra Drakefire's royal bloodline and legitimate claim to the Northern Throne. 3 council members witnessed this confirmation directly and can attest to its validity. He paused, noting the varying reactions among the elders. Those who had witnessed the ritual, Mary, Corvin, and Tolan, nodded solemnly in confirmation. Others showed expressions ranging from stunned disbelief to calculating assessment. Thorn's face remained stone-like, giving nothing away. Second, Magnus continued, representatives of the Shadowrunner territory have arrived at our gates, offering formal alliance in recognition of Alexandra's confirmed status. Their leader, Blood Elder Lyanna Shadowcrest, brings warriors prepared to stand alongside our own forces against common threats. This news provoked more visible reactions. Murmurs of surprise, exchanged glances, one elder leaning forward with intense interest. The Shadowrunners were renowned for both their fighting prowess and their traditionally isolationist policies. Their sudden offer of alliance represented a seismic shift in territorial politics. Third, and most immediately concerning, Ravencroft forces have established position at our eastern border. Approximately 30 warriors with combat equipment and silver-based weapons, maintaining formation consistent with preparation for potential engagement. Their presence without diplomatic notification constitutes a territorial violation requiring response. Magnus paused, allowing the council to process the comprehensive situation before continuing. These 3 developments are not coincidental. The Renanga ritual generated spiritual energies detectable by sensitives throughout the territories. The Shadowrunners responded with offered alliance. Ravencroft responded with military positioning. All reflect recognition of a fundamental truth confirmed today. The royal bloodline survives in Alexandra Drakefire. Thorn broke his silence at this point, his voice tight with controlled anger. A truth confirmed in a ritual conducted without full council oversight, witnessed by only selected members, while I was conveniently assigned to distant border inspection. The ritual required limited participants for both spiritual and security reasons, Magnus replied evenly. The witnesses were selected for their complementary expertise, historical knowledge, security assessment, and diplomatic perspective. Their testimony stands independent of political considerations. Everything about this situation is political, Thorn countered. An alleged royal heir appears at our borders. A ritual unseen in generations is hastily arranged. Loyalist forces conveniently arrive offering alliance, and Ravencroft responds exactly as anyone would predict. This entire scenario follows restoration propaganda narratives with suspicious precision. Elder Mary interjected before Magnus could respond. I witnessed the Runanga ritual directly, Thonglin Thorn. What manifested cannot be falsified or manufactured. The ancestral spirits confirmed Alexandra Drakefire's bloodline through displays of power, unlike anything recorded in our histories. Spirits can be deceived, Thorn insisted. Ancient magics can be manipulated. This entire situation has been orchestrated to force Ironwood into the restoration conflict when our survival depends on maintaining neutrality. Garrick raised a hand for silence before the debate could escalate further. We have heard differing interpretations of these events. Now we must determine Ironwood's official response. He turned to Magnus. Thong Soai, what course of action do you recommend based on your assessment of the situation? It was the question Magnus had been preparing to answer since the ritual concluded. His response would shape not just the immediate crisis, but Ironwood's position in the territorial realignments certain to follow. I recommend the following actions, he stated with calm authority. First, formal acknowledgement of Alexandra Drakefire's confirmed identity as legitimate heir to the Northern Throne, granting her protected status under Ironwood's sovereignty. Second, provisional acceptance of Shadowrunner Alliance for immediate security coordination, with formal political alliance to be negotiated through standard protocols. Third, enhancement of defensive positions along all borders with clear communication to Ravencroft forces that unauthorized incursion will be treated as hostile action. The recommendations were precisely calibrated, acknowledging Alexandra's identity while respecting council authority over formal alliances and framing the response to Ravencroft's forces as defense of sovereignty rather than direct confrontation. Nevertheless, they represented a clear shift from Ironwood's traditional neutrality toward active involvement in restoration politics. Thorne responded immediately. These recommendations amount to declaration of war against Ravencroft territories. They abandon generations of careful neutrality that has preserved Ironwood's independence and security. I formally oppose this course of action and demand full council vote before any implementation. The vote is your right, Garrick acknowledged. But first, all council members deserve complete information regarding the Runanga ritual and its implications. He turned to the three witnesses. Elders Makery, Corvin, and Tolan will now provide their formal testimony regarding what they observed during the ritual. All members will withhold further debate until this testimony is complete. For the next 30 minutes, the three witnesses described the extraordinary manifestations they had observed. The golden light emanating from Alexandra's form, the phoenix mark glowing through her robes, the ancestral murals appearing on chamber walls, the formal declaration spoken in her voice layered with others. Each account aligned precisely with the others, providing consistent confirmation of supernatural validation that transcended political manipulation. As the testimony concluded, Magnus observed the shifting expressions among council members. Even those aligned with Thorne's faction appeared shaken by the detailed descriptions of ancestral power manifesting in ways that couldn't be dismissed as political theater. Garrick allowed a moment of contemplative silence before speaking. The testimony stands as entered into council record. Before proceeding to formal vote on the Thong Soai's recommendations, are there additional perspectives that would inform our deliberations? An unexpected voice spoke from the chamber entrance. Perhaps mine might prove relevant. All heads turned to see Liana Shadowcrest standing in the doorway, her silver hair and distinctive eyes immediately identifying her to those who hadn't yet encountered the Shadowrunner delegation. Blood Elder Shadowcrest, Garrick acknowledged, surprise evident in his voice. This is a closed council session, and yet its outcome affects all territories, Liana replied, stepping into the chamber with the confident bearing of one accustomed to authority. The Shadowrunners offer not just military alliance, but comprehensive intelligence regarding Ravencroft's activities throughout the fragmented lands, information that directly impacts the decision before you. Procedurally, allowing an external representative to address the council during deliberation violated protocol. But these were extraordinary circumstances, and Liana's reference to intelligence potentially crucial to their decision created reasonable justification for exception. Garrick glanced around the semicircle, assessing the elders' reactions. Seeing no immediate objection, even from Thorne, whose political instincts apparently recognized the value of hearing this intelligence, he nodded permission. The council will hear your information, Blood Elder, understanding that final deliberation remains our sovereign responsibility. Liana inclined her head in acknowledgement of the boundaries, then moved to stand beside Magnus at the chamber's center. Though they had only just met, the symbolic positioning created visual suggestion of alliance between Ironwood's military commander and the Shadowrunner leader, a political statement in itself. Ravencroft's forces at your border represent only the visible manifestation of his response to today's events, Liana began without preamble. Our intelligence network confirms that his elite hunters have already infiltrated Ironwood territory through multiple access points, utilizing magical concealment and specialized silver weaponry designed specifically for royal bloodline suppression. This confirmation of Magnus's tactical concerns provoked immediate reaction among the council. Even Thorne straightened in his seat, his political opposition temporarily overshadowed by the immediate security threat. Furthermore, Lyanna continued, the Crimson Eclipse ritual Magnus Blackthorne previously reported to this council is indeed in final preparation stages. Ravencroft has constructed the ceremonial site at the ancient throne location, gathered sacrificial subjects from each territory, and assembled the ritual components required to corrupt the royal bloodline connection. All that remains is capture of Alexandra Drakefire herself. She paused, allowing the implications to register before delivering her most significant revelation. What you may not yet realize is that Ravencroft has already scheduled the ritual for the coming blood moon, mere days from now. His hunters operate under orders to capture Alexandra by any means necessary, regardless of territorial sovereignty or civilian casualties. The force at your border exists primarily to prevent escape, not to execute frontal assault. The comprehensive intelligence painted a far more urgent picture than many council members had likely been considering. This wasn't merely a political decision about restoration support, but an immediate security crisis requiring decisive response. How do you know these details? Thorne demanded, voicing the skepticism some might harbor about such specific claims. The Shadowrunners have maintained the continent's most extensive intelligence network since the Great Purge, Lyanna replied without defensiveness. Survival in isolation required perfect awareness of threats. Additionally, 3 of Ravencroft's inner circle secretly support restoration while maintaining their positions to provide critical information. Her revelation of infiltration at Ravencroft's highest levels startled even Magnus, who had not been privy to this particular intelligence despite his increasing involvement with restoration efforts. If your information is accurate, Elder Corvin said slowly, Ironwood faces imminent threat regardless of our political position on restoration. Ravencroft hunters operating within our territory constitutes violation of sovereignty agreements that predate even the territory wars. Precisely, Lyanna confirmed. Neutrality is no longer an available position. Ravencroft has already violated your sovereignty. The only remaining choice is how Ironwood responds to that violation. The chamber fell silent as council members processed the comprehensive situation. Magnus observed their expressions, assessing the shifting political calculations occurring behind carefully controlled facades. Even Thorne appeared caught between his opposition to restoration involvement and his territorial pride that rebelled against Ravencroft's violation of Ironwood's sovereignty. The council will now deliberate and vote, Garrick announced, after allowing appropriate consideration time. Blood Elder Shadowcrest, we appreciate your intelligence contribution. Please withdraw while we complete our constitutional process. Lyanna nodded respectfully and departed, leaving the council to its momentous decision. Magnus remained at the chamber's center, standing firm as the embodiment of his recommendations. Thongsui Blackthorne has presented 3 recommendations for Ironwood's response to current developments, Garrick summarized formally. Each will be considered and voted upon separately, requiring simple majority for approval. First, formal acknowledgement of Alexandra Drakefire's confirmed identity as legitimate heir to the Northern Throne, granting her protected status under Ironwood's sovereignty. Council members will now vote. The process proceeded with solemn dignity despite the crisis atmosphere. Each elder spoke their position clearly, support or oppose, with occasional brief explanation of reasoning. Magnus tracked the count carefully, maintaining impassive expression despite the enormously consequential nature of what transpired. When voting concluded on the first recommendation, Garrick announced the result. 8 support, 4 oppose. Recommendation approved. It was a stronger majority than Magnus had anticipated. The Renanga witnesses had clearly swayed several council members who might otherwise have aligned with Thorne's opposition. Second recommendation, Garrick continued, provisional acceptance of Shadowrunner Alliance for immediate security coordination, with formal political alliance to be negotiated through standard protocols. Council members will now vote. This measure faced more divided opinion, with some elders expressing concern about association with the territory known for restoration support, while acknowledging the practical security benefits of additional warriors against Ravencroft's threat. When voting concluded, the results stood at 7 support, 5 oppose, still sufficient for approval. Third recommendation, enhancement of defensive positions along all borders with clear communication to Ravencroft forces that unauthorized incursion will be treated as hostile action. Council members will now vote. This final measure received the strongest support, 10 in favor, only 2 opposed, reflecting Ironwood's unified response to violation of territorial sovereignty, regardless of political differences regarding restoration. All 3 recommendations have received majority approval and are hereby established as official Ironwood policy, Garrick declared formally. Thong Soi Blackthorn is authorized to implement necessary actions in accordance with these determinations. Magnus inclined his head in acknowledgement, his expression revealing nothing of the profound significance this represented. Within a single council session, Ironwood had transformed from neutral territory to the first major power formally recognizing Alexandra Drakefire's legitimate claim, a decision that would reshape territorial politics throughout the fragmented lands. Implementation begins immediately, he stated. Given confirmed intelligence regarding Ravencroft hunters within our territory, I request council authorization for enhanced security measures surrounding Alexandra Drakefire, including Shadowrunner protective units integrated with our own forces. Granted, Garrick confirmed without requiring additional vote, the authorization fell within previously approved measures. This council session is adjourned. Thong Soi Blackthorn will provide regular updates as the situation develops. As the chamber began to clear, Thorn approached Magnus directly, his expression tight with controlled anger, but his voice pitched for privacy. You've fundamentally altered Ironwood's position without fully considering the consequences, Commander. When Ravencroft's full military might respond to this provocation, remember that you chose this path. I chose to acknowledge truth confirmed by ancestral spirits, Magnus replied evenly. I chose to defend our territorial sovereignty against violation. I chose to secure alliance with warriors who share our immediate security interests. He met Thorn's gaze steadily. All choices, the Thong Soi is empowered to recommend for council consideration through our constitutional process. Constitutional process manipulated through carefully controlled ritual, selective witnesses, and convenient intelligence from restoration allies, Thorn countered. But what's done is done. Now we face the consequences together. His expression shifted from anger to cold determination. For Ironwood's sake, I hope your faith in this alleged royal heir proves justified. Without waiting for a response, Thorn departed, leaving Magnus to contemplate the complex path ahead. The council's decision represented crucial first steps, but implementation would require precise coordination of military, diplomatic, and now magical resources given Alexandra's enhanced abilities following the ritual. Speaking of which, Magnus departed the council chambers and headed directly to his strategy room where Alexandra awaited news. The corridor seemed different somehow, not physically altered, but carrying a subtle energy that hadn't been present before. Perhaps it was merely his awareness of the momentous changes occurring, or perhaps the ritual had indeed affected the territory itself as Alexandra had suggested. He found her standing at the window, gazing toward the eastern border where Ravencroft's forces maintained their position. The setting sun cast her profile in gold and shadow, highlighting the regal bearing that seemed increasingly natural since the ritual's completion. The council has spoken, she said without turning, somehow aware of his presence and his news. Ironwood acknowledges my claim. Yes. Magnus moved to stand beside her, following her gaze toward the distant tree line that marked their territorial boundary. All 3 recommendations approved by majority vote. You now have official, protected status under Ironwood's sovereignty. The Shadowrunners are provisionally accepted as allies for immediate security coordination, and our defenses are enhanced with authorization to treat unauthorized incursions as hostile action. Alexandra turned to face him, her silver-gold eyes studying his expression. And what of Ravencroft's hunters already within your territory? Lyanna confirmed their presence. She informed the council as well, Magnus confirmed. Enhanced security measures have been authorized in response. You'll have integrated protection units, Ironwood guards, and Shadowrunner warriors working in coordination. The pieces align. Alexandra murmured, her gaze distant for a moment, as though perceiving patterns beyond ordinary vision. Generations of preparation, of waiting, of maintaining hope when all seemed lost. Now suddenly events accelerate toward resolution, whether restoration or final defeat. You suspected this would happen, Magnus observed. When you came to Ironwood, you anticipated that events would unfold in this manner. Rapidly, dramatically. forcing decisions that might otherwise have taken months or years of careful diplomatic work. A small smile touched her lips. I hoped rather than anticipated. The ritual's power exceeded even loyalist expectations. The ancestral spirits didn't merely confirm my identity, they actively participated in awakening the covenant between royal blood and territorial energies. She extended her hand, summoning the now familiar golden flame that danced above her palm with enhanced intensity. My connection to the primal forces grows stronger by the hour. The land responds to the bloodline's return. This development represented both strategic advantage and potential complication. Alexandra's growing powers provided defensive capabilities against Ravencroft's hunters, but also made concealing her presence increasingly difficult. The very energies that confirmed her legitimacy also made her more detectable to those with spiritual sensitivity. We need to move you to the secured location prepared in the Northwest Tower, Magnus decided. Integrated protection units are being assembled. Captain Wolf will coordinate with Lyanna's warriors to establish defensive perimeters. Alexandra extinguished the flame with a closing of her fingers. Lyanna will insist on seeing me directly. Our connection predates even my earliest memories. She helped smuggle me from the palace during the massacre, risking her life to preserve the bloodline. I'll arrange the meeting once security protocols are established, Magnus promised. For now, our priority is movement to a more defensible position. Ravencroft's hunters could be anywhere in the territory, using magical concealment to evade detection. As if summoned by his words, the warning crystal at his belt flared suddenly with urgent heat, the signal for imminent threat requiring immediate response. Simultaneously, Alexandra's head snapped toward the door, her enhanced senses detecting something beyond ordinary perception. "They're here," she said quietly, a statement rather than question. Magnus drew his sword, a silver-edged blade designed for combat against supernaturally enhanced opponents. "How many? Can you sense their positions?" Alexandra closed her eyes briefly, accessing her newly strengthened connection to territorial energies. "3, no, 4, moving through the corridor toward this chamber. Their energy signatures are masked, but the masking itself creates disturbance in the natural flow." Tactically, their position was suboptimal. The strategy room had been selected for planning sessions, not defensive operations. It had only one exit to the main corridor, now apparently covered by approaching hunters. The windows offered potential escape route, but required navigating a sheer drop of at least 30 feet to the courtyard below. Manageable for werewolves in ordinary circumstances, but potentially dangerous with silver-armed hunters in pursuit. "Stay behind me," Magnus instructed, moving toward the door while activating his communication crystal. "Wolf, security breach near command center. Hunter team approaching my strategy room. Send reinforcements immediately." The crystal pulsed with acknowledgement, but Magnus harbored no illusions about timing. Reinforcements would take minutes to arrive. The hunters would reach them in seconds. "There's another option," Alexandra said calmly. "One they won't anticipate." Before Magnus could question her meaning, she extended both hands toward the stone wall adjacent to the windows. Golden energy flowed from her fingers, seeping into the ancient stones, causing them to shimmer briefly before physically separating, creating an opening where solid wall had stood moments before. "The royal bloodline's connection to Ironwood Fortress predates even its current construction," she explained, seeing Magnus's startled expression. "The original foundations were laid with stones blessed by the first queen. They respond to direct bloodline command in times of need." It was an extraordinary demonstration of the covenant between royal blood and territory, and a tactical advantage Magnus hadn't anticipated. "Can you seal it behind us?" Alexandra nodded. "Once we're through." The newly created passage led to a narrow staircase Magnus had never seen on any fortress schematic, one that apparently wound through the very structure of the tower itself. They entered quickly, Alexandra sealing the wall behind them with another gesture that caused the stones to reconnect seamlessly. Just in time, through the solid wall came muffled sounds of the strategy room door being forced open, followed by frustrated voices discovering their quarry vanished. "This staircase connects to the original network of royal passages," Alexandra explained as they descended the hidden steps. "Most were sealed or built over during later renovations, but they remain accessible to those with bloodline connection." "Where does it lead?" Magnus asked, maintaining combat readiness despite their apparent escape. "To the heart of the fortress, the foundational chamber where territorial wards are anchored." Alexandra moved with confident familiarity, despite presumably never having been in this passage before. From there, we can access multiple routes to secured locations. The stairs wound downward far deeper than Magnus had realized the fortress extended. After several minutes of descent, they opened into a large circular chamber unlike any he had seen in Ironwood. Ancient stones formed perfect rings around a central dais, each carved with runes that glowed faintly with golden light. The air hummed with energy that raised the hair on Magnus's arms, primal power focused and contained through ancient magic. The heart of Ironwood, Alexandra said softly, reverence in her voice, where the territory's defensive wards are anchored to the land itself. Few even know this chamber exists. Fewer still could access it without bloodline connection. Magnus studied the space with tactical appreciation. Can you sense the hunter's positions from here? Alexandra moved to the central dais, placing her palms on its smooth surface. The golden light in the surrounding runes intensified immediately, responding to her bloodline energy. They're searching the upper levels, she reported, eyes closed in concentration, spreading outward from the strategy room. But, her brow furrowed, there are more than I initially sensed. At least 8 hunters within the fortress walls, using coordinated search patterns. And her eyes snapped open, alarm evident in their silver-gold depths. Ravencroft himself approaches the northern gate. His energy signature is unmistakable. This development dramatically altered the strategic situation. Ravencroft personally entering Ironwood territory represented either supreme confidence or desperate determination, perhaps both. His presence would embolden his hunters while potentially demoralizing defenders who understood the Grand Duke's formidable combat reputation. We need to re-establish contact with our forces, Magnus decided. Coordinate defensive response with Wolf and Lyanna's warriors. Alexandra nodded, then gestured toward one of the chamber's walls, where another hidden passage shimmered into visibility. This route leads to the Northwest Tower, your planned secure location. From there, you can command Ironwood's defense while I activate the territory's ancient wards through the bloodline connection. The calm certainty in her voice gave Magnus pause. What exactly would that entail? The ritual awakened my connection to territorial energies, but it can be strengthened further, Alexandra explained. From this chamber, I can access the original protective wards established when Ironwood was founded, defensive magics tied directly to royal bloodline that have lain dormant since the Great Purge. These wards, what effects would they have? They would reveal all hostile intruders within our boundaries, stripping away magical concealment. They would strengthen our defenders, enhancing natural abilities through connection to territorial essence. And they would establish boundaries that no enemy could cross without confronting concentrated defensive power. The tactical advantages were obvious and significant, but Magnus recognized the underlying implication. Such activation would be irreversible declaration, not just Ironwood acknowledging your claim, but you actively assuming aspects of royal authority within our territory. Alexandra met his gaze steadily. Yes, it would be the first tangible exercise of bloodline power over territorial essence since my ancestors ruled these lands, a precedent with far-reaching implications beyond the immediate crisis. The moment crystallized everything that had occurred since Alexandra's arrival at their borders. From refugee to intelligence asset to confirmed royal heir to potential sovereign, exercising mystical authority, each transition carrying progressively greater political significance. This final step would irrevocably alter Ironwood's position in territorial politics. Yet with Ravencroft's hunters already infiltrating the fortress and the Grand Duke himself approaching their gates, pragmatic security concerns outweighed political caution. Do it, Magnus decided. Activate the wards. I'll coordinate conventional defenses from the Northwest Tower. Alexandra nodded solemnly, understanding the significance of his authorization. The passage will lead you directly to your secured position. I'll remain here to maintain the ward activation. Alone, with hunters in the fortress? Magnus objected. Too dangerous. This chamber is the most secure location in Ironwood, she countered. Only bloodline connection can open its passages, and my abilities are strongest at this focal point of territorial energy. She smiled slightly. Besides, once the wards activate, every defender in Ironwood will know exactly where our enemies are located. Your forces can eliminate the hunters, while I maintain our territorial protection. The strategy was sound, despite Magnus's instinctive reluctance to leave her without direct protection. If her bloodline connection to the ancient wards worked as described, It represented their best defense against both infiltrated hunters and Ravencroft's approaching force. Very well, he conceded, but I'll send trusted guards to this location as soon as communication is reestablished. Alexandra nodded agreement. Then, in a gesture that bridged formal alliance and personal connection, she reached out to clasp his forearm in the traditional warrior's grip they had shared earlier. "Command well, Magnus Blackthorn," she said simply. "Ironwood's defenders stand at a pivotal moment in our shared history." "And you, Alexandra Drakefire," he replied, returning the grip with firm pressure. "May ancestral spirits guide your power as they confirmed your claim." Their eyes held for a moment longer than strictly necessary, acknowledging the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point, from interrogation room confrontation to allies activating ancient magics together. Then duty reasserted itself, and Magnus turned toward the passage that would return him to conventional command responsibility. As he reached the hidden doorway, Alexandra had already moved to the central dais, kneeling with palms pressed to its surface. Golden energy began flowing from her hands into the stone, awakening runes that had slumbered for generations. The chamber's ambient hum intensified, vibrating through the very foundations of the fortress. Magnus proceeded through the passage, sword ready, mind already formulating defensive strategies for the confrontation ahead. Behind him, ancient power awakened under royal command. Before him, conventional forces prepared for battle against enemies, both infiltrated and approaching. Ironwood stood at the cusp of transformation, not just in its political position regarding restoration, but in its fundamental connection to the territorial magics that had sustained the fragmented land since time immemorial. Whether that transformation would bring renewed balance or devastating conflict remained to be seen. One certainty remained. After generations of fragmentation, isolation, and discord, the balance of power throughout the territories had begun its inevitable shift toward restoration of ancient covenant. And Magnus Blackthorn, once dedicated to neutrality and established order, now found himself at the vanguard of change that would reshape their world.